There is something quietly remarkable about the night, the way it settles over a city, like a soft blanket drawn across the rooftops, dimming the noise, smoothing the edges, letting the world breathe at a slower tempo. I find myself drawn into the stillness of it, standing at the edge of thought, looking out across a landscape that hums with its own quiet rhythm. Street lamps casting long amber pools onto wet pavement, shadows moving gently at the periphery, and somewhere in the distance the low murmur of a city that never fully stops. It is in these hours, these long, unhurried hours, that I find myself thinking about the people who walk through the dark so that others do not have to. There is a figure somewhere in this imagined cityscape, moving along a cobblestone street, not hurrying, not alarmed, simply present, watchful in the way that ancient things are watchful, steady in the way that rivers are steady, carrying the weight of something much older than this particular night or this particular street. That figure belongs to one of the oldest institutions in human civilization, an institution so woven into the fabric of daily life that we rarely pause to consider how it came to be, how it was shaped and reshaped across centuries of shifting need and shifting trust. I am thinking about police not in the way one thinks of headlines or arguments or the charged language of modern debate, but in the quieter, deeper way, the way a historian might lean back in a candlelit chair and begin to trace the long, winding thread of an idea that humanity has returned to again and again across thousands of years, the idea that someone must keep watch. The idea is older than cities, really, older than written law, older than most of the structures we take for granted. It lives somewhere in the earliest human impulse to protect what is shared, the grain stores, the water, the children, the flame. In every settlement that has ever grown large enough to hold strangers, there has been a question, a quiet, persistent question asked at the edge of every gathering and every market and every darkened alley. Who is watching tonight? And tonight I want to follow that question, slowly, without urgency. The way one follows a river upstream through a landscape it has carved over centuries, tracing the banks, reading the turns, pausing where the current runs deeper. I imagine myself now in a kind of open, timeless space, part library, part ancient hall, with stone floors and tall windows that let in the cool blue light of a sky somewhere between dusk and the deep middle of night. The shelves here are full, dense with record and memory, with the weight of every attempt humanity has ever made to organize the act of watching over itself, with the stories of constables and night watchmen, of magistrates and runners, of commissioners and beats and badges and codes. There is something almost ceremonial about the atmosphere here, something that asks for patience and quiet, the same way a very old cathedral asks you to lower your voice, not because the building demands it, but because something in its proportions speaks of duration, of all the years that have pressed themselves into its stones. I let myself settle into that feeling now. The air carries the faint scent of old paper and cool stone, and perhaps something else, something harder to name, the particular quality that lingers in spaces where serious things have been considered over a long stretch of time. Outside these tall windows, a city is doing what cities do. It breathes and shifts and carries it as people through their evenings. Somewhere out there, a light is on above a doorway. A car moves slowly through an intersection. A dog pauses at the edge of a pool of lamplight, sniffing the air, then continues on. And somewhere in that ordinary nighttime picture, there is a uniform, a presence, a person whose particular role in this unfolding evening is to hold the thread that connects order to possibility, to stand at the invisible boundary between the life a community intends to have and the disruption that is always waiting at the margins. That role has so many names across so many centuries and so many cultures that naming them all would take the whole of this long evening. But the function, the essential, quietly astonishing function, has remained recognizable across all of them. Someone must watch, and someone must be accountable for watching. And how a society decides who that someone will be, how it trains them, equips them, constrains them, and empowers them, says something profound about that society's relationship with itself, with trust and fear, and the question of how much freedom a person can hold before the freedom of another begins to fray. These are not small questions, and I have no intention of rushing through them. The world is not going anywhere tonight. The city beyond these windows will still be breathing when we reach the far shore of this long, unhurried journey through history and structure and the slow evolution of an idea. So I settle deeper into this imagined space. Let the lamplight warm the edges of the room. Let the shelves lean in with their patient, accumulated weight of knowing. And I begin at the beginning, not the sharp, clear beginning of a single moment or a single invention, but the soft, gradual beginning of an idea gathering itself across the long span of human time. The beginning that sounds like a question murmured at the edge of a fire long before any of the words we use today had been invented. Who is watching tonight, and what do we owe each other in the watching? The earliest answer to that question did not come from any government or charter or written code of law. It came from something far more immediate, from the simple, pressing reality of people living close together, sharing resources, sharing boundaries, sharing the particular anxieties that arise when your neighbor's choices begin to affect your own survival. In the ancient world, the keeping of order was not a profession. It was a communal obligation, something distributed across the body of a community, the way that any essential task is distributed when there is no specialist to perform it. In the villages and early settlements of Mesopotamia, those sun-baked clusters of mud brick and irrigation channel that gave rise to the first recognizable cities, there was already a sense that certain individuals carried the responsibility of enforcement, not police in any modern sense, but something that served the same fundamental need. The temple administrators of Sumer kept records of grain and debt and dispute, and the resolution of conflict, the prevention of theft, the maintenance of the pathways between fields. All of this fell to people whose authority derived not from a badge or a warrant, but from position within a social structure that everyone had silently agreed to recognize. It is a fragile kind of authority, that kind, built entirely from collective consent, and yet it held, for thousands of years in various forms, it held. The ancient Egyptians developed something that looked, from a certain angle, more deliberately organized. The pharaoh's administration employed a class of officials whose duties included the patrolling of borders and the policing of grain stores, temples, and royal property. There is evidence, carved into stone and pressed into clay, that these officials worked with a kind of trained consistency, that there were hierarchies among them, and roles, and even something resembling a chain of command. The Medjay are among the most recognized of these early enforcement figures. Originally a group of Nubian warriors employed by the Egyptian state, they were gradually absorbed into a broader security function, patrolling the desert frontiers, guarding tombs in the Valley of the Kings, and eventually serving as a kind of proto-police force within Egyptian society itself. The word carried enough weight that it persisted in the language long after the original Medjay people had blended into the general population, becoming a common term for police or guard in the Egyptian vernacular, which is itself a remarkable thing, that a role can outlast the people who first defined it, that a function can become a word, and a word can carry a function forward across centuries, like a ship carrying freight across a very long sea. In ancient China, the Zhou dynasty, stretching across roughly 800 years beginning around the 11th century before the Common Era, developed a remarkably elaborate administrative structure that included officials responsible for maintaining order within the state's territories. The concept of the magistrate, the scholar official who held judicial and administrative power simultaneously, became one of the defining features of Chinese governance for millennia, and the enforcement arm of that magistrate's authority was the yamen runner, a figure who served as investigator, arresting officer, and enforcer all at once. These were not idealized figures. The yamen runners occupy a complicated place in Chinese historical memory, associated both with the necessary work of maintaining order and with the corruption that tends to accumulate wherever low-paid officials hold significant informal power. That tension between the necessity of the enforcement role and the vulnerability of that role to abuse is one of the oldest and most persistent themes in the entire history of policing, and we will find it surfacing again and again as we move through the centuries. In ancient Rome, the organization of public order reached a level of institutional complexity that had no real precedent in the ancient world. The city of Rome at its height held perhaps 1 million people within its walls, a density of human life that created problems of order and safety that no informal community arrangement could adequately address. The Emperor Augustus, who consolidated power in the decades surrounding the turn of the first century of the Common Era, recognized that the sheer scale of Rome required something new. He established the vigiles, a body of freedmen whose responsibilities included patrolling the city at night, responding to fires, and apprehending those who disturbed the peace. 7 cohorts of about 1,000 men each were distributed across the 14 districts of the city, giving Rome what is often described as the first recognizable municipal police and fire service in Western history. The vigils were supplemented by the cohort urbanae, the urban cohorts, a heavier, more militarized force responsible for more serious public order situations. And above them, the Praetorian Guard, whose primary purpose was the protection of the emperor himself, but who also formed a kind of ultimate reserve force for the city. What Augustus had built was not one thing but a layered system, different bodies for different scales of threat, operating with different authorities and different levels of force. It was an architecture of order that reflected something Augustus understood intuitively, that in a city of sufficient complexity, no single kind of enforcement is adequate. That insight, that policing requires differentiation, that not all disorder requires the same response, would take many centuries to resurface in the Western tradition after Rome fell. The centuries following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire were not, of course, without order, but the mechanisms of order became local, fragmented, rooted in the land and in the personal loyalties of feudal obligation. In early medieval Europe, the enforcement of law was largely the responsibility of whoever held local power, the lord, the bishop, the guild master, and beneath those figures the community itself was often made collectively responsible for the behavior of its members. The frank pledge system in Anglo-Saxon and early Norman England is one of the clearest expressions of this collective responsibility. Under this arrangement, adult men were organized into groups of roughly 10 households called tithings, and each group was held jointly responsible for the conduct of its members. If one man in a tithing committed a crime, the others were expected to produce him for justice or face a collective fine. It was a system that turned neighbors into monitors of one another, that made social pressure a tool of enforcement in the absence of any formal police body. It was imperfect, and it was sometimes brutal in the casual way that medieval justice could be brutal, but it served the fundamental function of distributing the burden of order across the community, and it persisted in various forms for several centuries. The office of the constable, one of the most enduring titles in the history of policing, begins to emerge in England in the 12th and 13th centuries. The parish constable was an unpaid part-time official drawn from the ranks of ordinary community members, appointed by local justices to serve for a year at a time, responsible for serving warrants, maintaining the stocks, overseeing the watch, and performing whatever other enforcement functions the local magistrate required. It was not a prestigious role. In fact, it was frequently an unwanted one, a burden that property-owning men were required to take on by rotation, like jury duty made permanent for a year. Wealthier men routinely paid substitutes to serve in their place, which meant that the actual work of the constable often fell to men of limited education and fewer resources. And yet the office persisted and spread and carried the idea of community-based enforcement through centuries of change. The watch system developed alongside the constable in medieval English towns, particularly in London, where the sheer volume of nighttime disorder made some organized response unavoidable. And the Statute of Winchester in 1285 formalized the watch in law, requiring towns to maintain men on watch from sunset to sunrise, with the authority to detain strangers and hand over suspects to the constable in the morning. These watchmen were, in the popular memory of the period, figures of gentle ridicule as often as genuine security, poorly paid, poorly trained, sometimes elderly or infirm, occasionally found asleep at their posts by the very criminals they were meant to deter. The image of the bumbling night watchman became something of a comic fixture in English literature and theater, a gentle joke at the expense of an institution that everyone understood to be inadequate, even while they continued to rely on it. But even inadequate systems carry information. Even the bumbling watchman, making his slow rounds through the dark streets of a medieval market town, was performing something that the community had decided it needed: a visible presence, a nominal deterrent, a human signal that the darkness was not entirely unwatched. That desire for visible presence, for the mere fact of someone being there, moving through the night with some form of sanctioned authority, is a thread that runs all the way from those medieval watchmen to the patrol officer in a modern city. As the early modern period began to take shape, As trade expanded, cities grew denser, and the social order of the feudal world began to loosen its grip. The inadequacy of the old systems became harder to ignore. In France, the monarchy had taken a different path than England. The Lieutenant General of Police, an office created in Paris in 1667 under Louis XIV, represented one of the first attempts by a European state to create something approaching a professional, centrally organized police body for a major city. The Lieutenant General held extraordinary power, responsible not merely for public order, but for a vast range of regulatory and surveillance functions, monitoring printing presses, tracking foreigners, overseeing markets, managing the city's infrastructure of light and cleanliness. The Paris model was, in many ways, more modern than anything England would produce for another century and a half. But it was also, from the beginning, explicitly political, a tool of royal authority as much as a tool of public safety, and that dual nature would come to define how much of continental Europe thought about police as an arm of the state inherently connected to the exercise of power. England's suspicion of that model ran deep, rooted in centuries of resistance to standing armies and centralized authority, in a political culture that regarded any permanent body of men with the power to detain citizens as an inherent threat to liberty. That suspicion would shape the particular form that modern policing eventually took in the English-speaking world, and the tension it represented between the need for order and the fear of power would echo across every major debate about police reform that was yet to come. The long, slow night of history was moving toward a dawn of a different kind, the dawn of cities that the old systems could no longer manage, of populations growing faster than any informal arrangement could contain, of a world whose complexity was beginning to demand something new, something organized, something professional, something that would carry all the weight of everything that had come before it, and try optium imperfectly, as all human institutions try, to hold the line between the world that people wanted to live in and the disorder that pressed always at its edges. That something arrived, as so many transformations do, not in a single moment of invention, but in the slow accumulation of pressure that eventually cracks old stone. London in the early 19th century was a city in the grip of a particular kind of crisis, not sudden, not dramatic, but grinding and relentless, the kind that wears down resistance the way water wears down rock. The population had swelled to nearly 1.5 million souls, packed into streets that had been laid down centuries before anyone imagined such density. The gin houses ran day and night. The rookeries, those dense, lightless warrens of overcrowded tenements in St. Giles and Seven Dials, produced a particular quality of desperation that spilled outward into the broader city. And the old systems, the parish constables, the night watchmen, the patchwork of private arrangements and Bow Street runners, were simply not equal to the scale of what London had become. The Bow Street runners deserve a moment of quiet attention here, because they represent one of those fascinating intermediate stages in the evolution of an institution, too organized to be called informal, too limited to be called modern. Established in the 1750s under the magistrate Henry Fielding, yes, the same Henry Fielding who wrote Tom Jones, and later developed by his blind half-brother John, the Bow Street Runners were a small body of paid professional thief-takers operating out of the magistrate's court on Bow Street. They were investigators more than patrol officers, men who could be hired to pursue a specific case, track a stolen item, or bring a named suspect before the court. They wore no uniform, carried no standard equipment, and operated with a kind of entrepreneurial freelance quality that made them effective within their narrow scope and utterly inadequate for the broader problem of a city of millions. It was Robert Peel who finally broke through the long resistance. Peel was a politician of a considerable ability and considerable patience, a man who understood that the idea of a professional police force had been tried before in Parliament and defeated before, not because the need was unclear, but because the fear was genuine. The English political tradition had watched what police power looked like on the continent, had seen how the apparatus of state surveillance could be turned against ordinary citizens, had read enough history to know that a body of armed men loyal to the government was a thing that required very careful handling. Peel's genius was in understanding that the design of the institution had to address that fear directly, that the new police could not merely be effective, it had to be visibly, structurally different from the models that English political culture found threatening. And so, when the Metropolitan Police Act passed through Parliament in 1829, what emerged was something deliberately shaped to reassure as much as to enforce. The new Metropolitan Police was uniformed not in military red or blue, but in a dark blue tailcoat with a reinforced top hat, chosen specifically to distinguish the officer from a soldier, to signal civilian authority rather than military power. The officers were unarmed, at least initially, carrying only a short wooden truncheon and a rattle for raising the alarm, another deliberate signal that these men were not soldiers, that their authority derived from the consent of the community rather than from the capacity for lethal force. And they walked beats, fixed, regular routes through defined areas of the city, creating the visible presence that Peel and his commissioners Charles Rowan and Richard Mayne believed was the essential deterrent function of the new force. The principle that underpinned this design was articulated in a set of instructions that became known as the Peelian Principles. Though whether Peel himself wrote them, or whether they emerged from Rowan and Mayne's administrative thinking, is a question that historians have gently argued over ever since, but the ideas themselves are clear enough, and they remain remarkable for how directly they address the tension between authority and legitimacy. The police, the principles held, are the public, and the public are the police. The officers of the Metropolitan Police were to be understood not as a separate caste, set above the community, but as paid members of that community, given full-time responsibility for duties that in theory belonged to everyone. Their power derived not from the government that employed them, but from the consent of the people they served. And the measure of their effectiveness was not the number of arrests made or criminals punished, but the absence of crime and disorder altogether. It was an idealistic vision, and like all idealistic visions, the reality that followed was messier and more complicated than the principle. The first Metropolitan Police officers were recruited from the working class of London, men who were often barely literate, frequently dismissed for drunkenness in the early years, struggling to maintain the dignity and restraint that the institution demanded under conditions of considerable physical hardship and public hostility. The early officers were not welcomed by the communities they patrolled. They were called blue lobsters and blue devils, and worse, jeered at in the streets, pelted with refuse, occasionally attacked with enough coordinated violence that small riots broke out around the attempt to establish the new force in resistant neighborhoods. There is something poignant in that image, the new constable in his dark blue coat, walking his beat through streets that did not want him there, embodying an idea that the community had not yet decided to accept. And yet the institution survived its difficult infancy, survived the riots and the political opposition and the early scandals, and within a generation had become the model that police forces across Britain and across much of the world would attempt to replicate. The Metropolitan Police model spread to the major cities of England, Birmingham, Manchester, Bristol, each adapting the template to local conditions, local politics, local histories of resistance and accommodation, and across the Atlantic, where cities were growing with their own particular speed and their own particular anxieties, the idea crossed the water and took root in new soil. New York City established its own municipal police force in 1845, drawing explicitly on the London model while adapting it to the very different social landscape of American urban life. The American context introduced complications that Peele's London had not faced in quite the same way. Questions of race, of immigration, of a political culture in which the local ward boss held enormous informal power over every institution in his territory, including the police. The 19th century American urban police force was, for much of its early history, deeply enmeshed in the machinery of local politics. Officers were appointed not through any merit-based system, but through patronage, the gift of a ward captain or an alderman to a loyal supporter. The consequences were predictable, and they were documented with increasing alarm by reformers who watched the police function as an arm of political machines rather than as an impartial instrument of law. The beat officer in a mid-19th century American city often collected fees from saloon owners, brothel keepers, and gambling houses in exchange for protection from enforcement, not necessarily because he was a uniquely corrupt individual, but because the system itself had been constructed around that exchange. It was a shadow economy of enforcement, one that served the interests of those who controlled both the machine and the vice, and served the ordinary citizen considerably less well. This was the era in which policing began to accumulate the complex, contested reputation that it carries into the present, not simply as a force for order, but as a force whose relationship with order was always shaped by the particular interests and power structures of its time and place. In the American South, the history runs darker still. The slave patrols that operated across the southern states from the early 18th century onward represent one of the most troubling threads in the broader fabric of American law enforcement history. These patrols, organized systems of white men empowered to monitor, detain, and return enslaved people who traveled without permission, were among the earliest formalized policing structures in much of the South, and their legacy cast a long shadow over the relationship between law enforcement and black communities that would persist with devastating consequences for generations. To trace the history of American policing honestly is to hold that thread alongside all the others, to understand that the institution as it developed in the United States was never a single thing, never one story, but a braided complexity of different origins, different purposes, and different relationships with different communities. Back in Britain, the second half of the 19th century brought its own wave of professionalization and reform. The detective function, always somewhat awkward within the uniformed patrol model, began to be formally institutionalized. Scotland Yard established its Criminal Investigation Department in 1878, creating a dedicated body of plainclothes investigators whose work would eventually become the template for detective units worldwide. The figure of the detective captured the public imagination in a way that the uniformed constable, for all his reassuring presence on the beat, never quite managed. Perhaps it was the intellectual quality of the work, the gathering of evidence, the reading of scenes, the reconstruction of events from fragments of physical trace. Perhaps it was the novelty of the idea that a crime could be solved not through confession or witness testimony alone, but through the careful, methodical analysis of what a criminal had left behind. Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes, arriving in print in 1887, both reflected and amplified this fascination, the detective as genius, as reader of invisible texts, as the one figure who could impose rational order on the chaos that crime represented. It was an idea that resonated powerfully with a Victorian culture deeply invested in the authority of reason and the progress of science. The real detectives of Scotland Yard were considerably less glamorous than Holmes, but they were developing genuine methodologies, building expertise in fingerprint analysis, photography, the systematic recording of criminal history, that were beginning to transform the investigative function from an art of intuition into something approaching a discipline. The late 19th century also brought the beginnings of a technological transformation in policing that would accelerate dramatically in the century to come. The telegraph allowed police stations to communicate across a city in minutes rather than hours. The telephone, arriving in the 1880s, began to change the relationship between the public and the police, making it possible for the first time to summon help with something approaching immediacy. The patrol wagon, the horse-drawn vehicle that could move officers quickly to a scene of disorder, changed the geography of policing, extending the effective reach of a station house far beyond what a walking officer could cover in a reasonable time. Each of these technologies quietly reshaped the work, changed what officers could do, where they could be, how quickly they could respond, and in doing so began to shift the underlying philosophy of the work itself. If a telephone call could summon an officer within minutes, then perhaps the slow, patient work of walking a beat, of knowing every face in a neighborhood, every door that opened onto trouble, every corner where trouble liked to gather, was less essential than it had seemed. That philosophical shift was still decades away from its full expression, but its seeds were being planted in the soil of the late Victorian city, watered by every new technology that made speed and response seem more important than presence and relationship, and the cities themselves kept growing, kept pressing against the edges of whatever systems had been designed to manage them, kept generating new forms of disorder and new demands on the institutions charged with addressing it. The 20th century was coming, bringing with it a scale of change, social, political, technological, philosophical, that would test the police institution more severely than anything that had come before. And somewhere in the long accumulation of all these years, all these watchmen and constables and runners and detectives and beat officers and plainclothes investigators, the shape of something recognizably modern was beginning to emerge. Not complete yet, not settled, still carrying all the contradictions and imperfections of its long, complicated origins, but present and watching as the world it had been built to serve moved forward into the uncertain light of a new century. The 20th century arrived with a particular kind of energy, a restless accelerating quality that touched every institution it encountered and left none of them quite as it had found them. For policing, the first decades of the new century brought the full flowering of what historians would later call the Reform era, a deliberate, sustained effort to transform the police from a creature of political patronage into something that resembled a professional organization. The man most associated with this transformation in the American context is August Vollmer, a figure who deserves to be better known outside the circles of criminal justice history because what he attempted was genuinely ambitious, nothing less than the reinvention of policing as a profession. Vollmer served as police chief of Berkeley, California from 1905 to 1932, and in that relatively small city on the western edge of a young country still working out what its institutions should look like, he built something that would influence police departments across the nation and eventually the world. He recruited college graduates at a time when police work was considered beneath the attention of educated men. He introduced systematic training programs, psychological screening, and academic coursework for officers. He pioneered the use of the automobile patrol at a time when most departments still relied entirely on officers walking beats or riding bicycles. He established the first forensic laboratory associated with a police department, bringing the tools and methods of scientific analysis into the daily work of investigation, insisting that evidence should be gathered, preserved, and analyzed with the same rigor that a scientist would bring to any other problem. Vollmer believed with the deep conviction of a reformer that professionalism was the answer to corruption, that if you raised the standards for who could become a police officer, educated them properly, paid them fairly, and held them accountable through clear organizational structures, you would produce an institution that could be trusted. It was a powerful idea, and it was not entirely wrong. The professionalization movement did succeed in reducing some of the most flagrant forms of political interference and individual corruption that had plagued 19th century urban policing, but it also introduced its own complications, its own unintended consequences that would take decades to fully surface. The professional model emphasized efficiency, hierarchy, and centralized command. It valued measurable outputs, arrest rates, response times, cleared cases, over the harder-to-quantify work of community relationship and trust. It drew the police officer out of the neighborhood and into the patrol car, replacing the intimate, slow knowledge of the beat officer with the faster, more detached perspective of someone moving through the city behind glass, responding to calls, processing incidents, moving on. In the 1950s and 1960s, the patrol car and the radio dispatch system became the dominant model of American policing. Officers were pulled from their beats assigned to vehicles and organized around the principle of rapid response. The theory was sound on its surface. If officers could respond quickly to calls for service, the deterrent effect would be maximized, crimes would be interrupted before they concluded, and the overall efficiency of the department would improve. What the theory missed, what took decades of difficult experience to understand, was the profound cost of severing the relationship between officers and the communities they served. The beat officer who walked the same 6 blocks every day for years knew things that no dispatcher could relay and no database could store. He knew which family was under stress, which corner was about to become a problem, which young man was teetering between 2 possible futures and might respond to a word said at the right moment. That knowledge, relational, granular, accumulated slowly over time, was the invisible infrastructure of community policing, and the patrol car model systematically dismantled it in the name of efficiency. The 1960s brought this tension to a breaking point in cities across America. The civil rights movement had placed the relationship between police and black communities at the center of the national conversation, and what that conversation revealed was not simply a matter of individual officers behaving badly, but of systemic patterns of enforcement that had been applied differently across racial lines for generations, of a history that the professionalization movement had done nothing to address, and in some ways had made worse by insulating the department from community accountability. The riots that swept through city after city in the middle years of the decade, Harlem in '64, Watts in '65, Detroit and Newark in '67, were not simply explosions of random violence. They were, in large part, responses to specific incidents of police conduct that ignited accumulated fury in communities that had been over-policed in some ways and underprotected in others for as long as anyone could remember. The Kerner Commission, appointed by President Lyndon Johnson to investigate the causes of the unrest, produced a report in 1968 that was unflinching in its conclusions. It identified police practices as a significant contributing factor to the conditions that had produced the riots, and it called for fundamental changes in how departments recruited, trained, and supervised their officers. The report was read widely, and then, as reports of that kind often are, it was filed away while the immediate crisis passed and the harder work of structural change was deferred. But the questions it raised did not go away. They accumulated quietly through the 1970s and 80s, gathering weight and urgency, waiting for the next crisis to bring them back to the surface. Meanwhile, in Britain and across Western Europe, the post-war decades brought their own evolution in police, organization, and philosophy. The British police model had retained more of its community orientation than the American system. The tradition of the unarmed constable walking a beat remained central to the self-image of British policing, even as the reality grew more complicated with the introduction of vehicles, specialist units, and increasing organizational complexity. The 1970s and 80s were difficult decades for British policing in ways that paralleled with local variations. The American experience, the miners' strike of 1984, brought images of police in riot gear, confronting civilians that sat uneasily with the Peelian ideal, and the Scarman Report, following the Brixton riots of 1981, drew conclusions about the relationship between police and black British communities that echoed across an ocean and a different history what the Kerner Commission had found in America. The challenge of riot control, of managing mass public disorder without either losing control of the situation or losing the legitimacy that democratic policing depended on, became one of the defining organizational problems of late 20th century policing. Specialist units trained in public order management, equipped with shields and protective gear, operating under command structures designed for coordinated group response, these became a fixture of police organizations that had originally been designed around the individual officer's relationship with individual members of the community. The tension between these two modes of policing, the intimate and the tactical, the relational and the paramilitary, would never be fully resolved, because both reflected genuine needs that a complex modern society placed on its police institutions simultaneously. The late 20th century also brought a technological revolution that transformed the operational capacity of police departments in ways that Vollmer could only have imagined. DNA analysis, arriving as a forensic tool in the mid-1980s, changed the evidentiary landscape of criminal investigation more profoundly than any development since fingerprinting. Suddenly, biological material left at a scene, material too small to see, could place a specific individual there with a certainty that no eyewitness account could match. The first use of DNA evidence to solve a murder occurred in Britain in 1986, when genetic profiling not only identified the actual killer of 2 young women in Leicestershire, but also exonerated a young man who had falsely confessed to one of the crimes. That second fact deserves to linger for a moment, because it carried within it a profound implication that would only grow more important as the decades passed. The technology that could prove guilt could equally prove innocence, and the history of wrongful convictions that DNA evidence would eventually begin to unravel was a history that policing and the justice system of which it was a part would have to reckon with seriously. The 1990s brought the widespread computerization of police records and communications, the ability to share information across departments, to search databases for patterns across cases, to identify connections that would have been invisible when information lived in paper files in separate buildings. CompStat, a management system introduced in the New York City Police Department in the early 1990s, represented a particular crystallization of the data-driven approach to policing. Regular meetings at which commanders were required to account for crime statistics in their precincts, armed with detailed maps and trend analyses, created a new accountability structure and a new pressure toward measurable results. The crime declines that followed in New York and in other cities that adopted similar approaches were real and significant, and the question of what caused them, CompStat, or the demographic shifts of the decade, or the fading of the crack epidemic, or some combination of all these factors, generated debate that continues among researchers to this day. But the data-driven model also generated its own pressures and its own distortions. When commanders are held accountable for numbers, there is an institutional incentive to manage the numbers, to downgrade offenses in reporting, to discourage the filing of complaints that would make the statistics look worse. And aggressive enforcement strategies pursued in the name of driving numbers down, stop-and-frisk policies applied with a statistical intensity that fell overwhelmingly on young men of color, produced exactly the kind of community fracture that the Peelian tradition had identified nearly 2 centuries earlier as the fundamental danger to police legitimacy. By the opening decades of the 21st century, policing found itself at a genuinely complex crossroads, carrying within its institutions the accumulated weight of all these histories, all these experiments, all these tensions never quite resolved. The events of 2015 and 2020, the deaths of black men and women in encounters with police that were captured on video and shared instantly across the world, brought those tensions into a public conversation of an intensity and breadth that had no real modern precedent. The phrase defund the police moved from activist circles into mainstream political debate, not meaning crushed for most of those who used it the literal elimination of police departments, but the redistribution of resources toward the social services, mental health response, housing, education, whose absence placed so much pressure on the police to manage problems they were not trained or equipped to solve. The concept of community policing, which had been proposed, piloted, partially implemented, and partially abandoned several times over the preceding decades, returned to the center of reform conversation with renewed urgency. And in departments across the country and around the world, thoughtful officers and administrators were wrestling with the same fundamental question that had been present since the beginning, since the Pelian principles, since the Frank Pledge system, since the Medjay walking the perimeter of an Egyptian settlement in the deep past. How do you hold a community's order without severing your connection to the community itself? How do you carry authority without becoming alien to the people that authority is meant to serve? How do you do a job that requires sometimes the application of force and maintain the trust of those on whose consent your legitimacy ultimately depends? These are not questions with clean answers. They are questions that each generation of policing inherits from the one before it, worn smooth at the edges from so much handling, never quite resolved, never quite set aside. And as I let the long arc of this history settle over me, as the details of centuries begin to soften and blend into one another, the way colors blend at the edge of a painting where the light falls gently across the canvas, I find myself drawn not toward conclusion, but toward something quieter, something that lives beneath the history itself, in the space where facts give way to feeling, where the specific gives way to the enduring. There is a quality in the long view of human institutions, a particular kind of wonder that comes from seeing how much effort, across how much time, has been devoted to the same essential problem. And that wonder, I think, deserves a moment of its own. The wonder I am thinking of is not the wonder of spectacle. It is not the gasp of something sudden and bright. It is the quieter, slower wonder of continuity, of noticing that a thread has run unbroken through thousands of years of human change, connecting the Medjay in the desert heat to the constable in the London fog, to the officer in the patrol car, moving through the amber wash of a modern city's nighttime streets. That thread is not made of law, exactly, and it is not made of force. It is made of something more fundamental than either of those things, something that might be called the communal act of attention, the decision made again and again in every culture that has ever grown complex enough to need it, that someone must be designated to pay a particular kind of notice to the world, to notice what is out of place, to notice who is frightened and who is dangerous, and where the boundary between those two things has become blurred, to notice the door left open that should be closed, the argument that has crossed from loud to violent, the child who is somewhere she should not be, at an hour when she should be somewhere safe. That act of structured noticing is, at its best, a form of care, a formalization of the impulse that moves any person to cross a street and ask if someone is all right, to pause in the middle of their own evening and make room for someone else's emergency. The institution that has grown up around that impulse is vast and complicated and imperfect in all the ways that vast and complicated human institutions are imperfect. But at its root, beneath all the organizational complexity and the political history and the technological transformation, there is still that original, simple thing. Someone is paying attention tonight, so that others do not have to pay it quite so vigilantly, so that the weight of watching can be, for a few hours at least, carried by someone else. There is a concept in the literature of organizational sociology called the paradox of the mandate, which observes that institutions created to address a problem inevitably become associated with that problem, that the fire department becomes associated with fire, the hospital with illness, the police with crime, and that this association over time shapes how communities feel about the institution itself. To see a police car in your rearview mirror is to feel something, even if you have done nothing wrong, even if the officer behind you is simply following the same road toward a different destination. The feeling arrives before the thought, carried in the nervous system's ancient catalog of things that require attention. That involuntary response is information about the power that policing holds in the human psyche, power that runs deeper than any particular policy or any particular incident, power rooted in the fundamental stakes of the encounter. The fact that this institution, alone among the civilian institutions of a democratic society, is authorized to use physical force in the performance of its duties, that authorization is not incidental to policing. It is definitional. The sociologist Egon Bittner, writing in the 1970s, argued that what distinguished police from every other institution in society was precisely this: not their law enforcement function, not their crime-fighting role, but their unique authorization to use coercive force when a situation seemed to require it. Everything else that police do, and the research consistently shows that the vast majority of police work involves no use of force whatsoever, that most encounters are about mediation and assistance and the management of situations that fall somewhere between crisis and inconvenience. Everything else exists in the shadow of that authorization. The uniform carries it. The badge carries it. The encounter carries it, even when it ends in nothing more than a piece of paper or a piece of advice. And that is why the question of legitimacy, of whether the community believes that the authorization is being exercised justly, proportionately, and without prejudice, is not merely a philosophical question or a political one. It is the operational foundation of everything the institution is trying to do. A police force that has lost the trust of the community it serves has not merely suffered a public relations problem. It has lost the thing that makes it work, because the vast majority of policing depends not on the capacity for force, but on the willingness of people to cooperate, to provide information, to appear as witnesses, to accept the authority of an officer's instruction without requiring that the instruction be physically enforced. When that willingness erodes, everything becomes harder. Every encounter carries more friction. Every interaction requires more energy to navigate. And the officers themselves, the human beings inside the uniforms, carrying their own fears and fatigues and moral complexities, are left to manage that friction with whatever tools and training and personal resources they possess. The research on police officer wellness has revealed, in recent decades, something that experienced officers have always known, but that institutions were slow to formally acknowledge: that the work extracts a particular kind of psychological cost, that regular exposure to trauma, to violence, to the worst moments of strangers' lives accumulates in the body and the mind in ways that do not simply resolve at the end of a shift. The rates of depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, and suicide among police officers are significantly higher than in the general population. And the cultural traditions of many departments, traditions that valued stoicism, that regarded the acknowledgement of a psychological difficulty as weakness, compounded the damage by ensuring that those who most needed support were least likely to seek it. There is something important in holding that fact alongside everything else, in remembering that the institution is made of people, that behind every policy and every statistic and every headline, there are human beings doing a job that asks more of them in certain ways than most jobs ask, and that the health of the institution and the health of those people are not separate questions. The most thoughtful voices in contemporary policing, the researchers, the reform-minded administrators, the community advocates, tend to arrive from very different directions at a similar insight that sustainability requires honesty, that an institution cannot improve what it will not examine, cannot address what it will not name, cannot earn trust it has not worked to deserve. And that work, the slow, unglamorous work of examination and accountability and incremental change, is perhaps the truest continuation of the long tradition we have been tracing tonight. Because the tradition has never been static. It has always been a conversation between what policing is and what it is trying to become, between the weight of what it carries from the past and the pull of what the communities it serves are asking it to be. That conversation is ongoing. It is happening right now in city councils and police academies and community meetings and courtrooms, and the quiet internal deliberations of officers who care deeply about doing the work well. And that, perhaps, is the most human thing about this ancient institution, not that it has solved the problem it was created to address, but that it keeps returning to the problem with the same stubborn seriousness that humanity brings to all its most important unfinished business. The night is very deep now, in the way that nights get when thought has traveled far, and the mind has grown soft around the edges of its certainty. I find myself back in that imagined hall with its tall windows and its shelves of patient memory. But the quality of the light has changed. The lamplight is softer now, the shadows longer, the weight of all those accumulated years settling into something that feels less like a burden and more like a kind of ballast. The city beyond the windows is quieter than it was, not silent. Cities are never silent, but quieter in the way that cities get when the latest hours have arrived and the noise has thinned to its essential residue. The distant sound of a vehicle moving through empty streets, the long drawn breath between one moment and the next. Out there somewhere in that quiet, a figure is moving down a street or through a corridor or across a parking lot, washed in the pale light of a security lamp, moving with the particular quality of attention that belongs to someone whose job is to notice. Not dramatic attention, not the taut alertness of a chase or a confrontation, simply the quiet, persistent watchfulness of someone who has accepted, for this stretch of hours, the responsibility of paying notice to the world on behalf of everyone who is not watching. That figure carries so much history without knowing it, carries the vigiles of Augustus, the parish constable with his rattle, the Bow Street runner in his civilian clothes, the first Metropolitan Police officer in his dark blue coat walking into a neighborhood that did not want him there, carries Vollmer's dream of a professional institution, carries the Kerner Commission's unheeded warnings, carries the DNA analyst in her laboratory, the community officer who knows every name on his block, the detective reading the invisible text of a crime scene by the light of a small torch. All of it carried forward through time by people who put on a uniform and went out into the dark because someone had to go. There is something worth honoring in that, something worth holding in quiet attention for a moment, the way one holds a candle flame to look at rather than to light the room, the flame of an idea that began before memory and has not gone out. The idea that a community can designate some of its own to watch over the rest. That order is not something that simply exists, but something that must be tended carefully by human hands. And in the deep stillness of this late hour, as thought begins to loosen its grip and the world grows soft and indistinct at the edges, that tending continues quietly, steadily, without fanfare or announcement, in the way that all the most essential things continue, moving through the dark with patient attention, keeping watch as the long night slowly turns toward morning. I imagine myself standing at the very edge of the known world, where the sea meets the sky in an endless line of silver and gray, and beyond that line lies everything that has not yet been named. The air here is different. It carries salt and uncertainty, and the faint scent of pine tar from the docks where wooden ships creak gently against their moorings. These vessels are small by any measure, their hulls dark with pitch, their sails furled and waiting, and yet they represent something far larger than their physical dimensions could ever contain. There is a particular quality to the light in these early morning hours, before the sun has fully claimed the horizon, when the world exists in that space between darkness and dawn. And it is in this in-between time that I find myself thinking about beginnings, about the moment when humanity looked out across the water and wondered what lay beyond the visible edge of everything. The docks stretch out behind me, wooden planks worn smooth by countless footsteps, by sailors and merchants, by dreamers and desperate men, all of them drawn to this threshold between the familiar and the unknown. And if I close my eyes, I can almost hear the conversations that must have filled these spaces, whispered plans and bold declarations, calculations made with imperfect instruments and incomplete maps. Maps, those fragile documents that tried to capture certainty where none existed. I think of them now, spread across rough wooden tables in dimly lit rooms, their edges held down by stones or daggers, their surfaces marked with careful lines and speculative shapes, some portions rendered in confident ink, others trailing off into blankness, into regions labeled with warnings or decorated with imagined monsters. The world, as it was understood then, was so much smaller than the world as it actually existed, and yet this gap between understanding and reality created a kind of gravity, a pull toward the unknown that some people simply could not resist. I walk along the waterfront now, my footsteps slow and deliberate, passing coils of rope thick as a man's arm, stacks of barrels containing provisions for journeys that might last months or years, salted meat and hardtack, water that would turn brackish and questionable, supplies chosen not for comfort but for survival, because once a ship left this harbor, once it sailed beyond the sight of land, it entered a realm where resupply was impossible, where every decision made before departure would echo forward into an uncertain future. There is a certain kind of courage required to step onto one of these vessels, knowing what the departure means, knowing that the sea keeps its own counsel, that it offers no promises, no guarantees of safe passage or triumphant return. And yet the ships kept leaving, generation after generation, pulled forward by curiosity and ambition, by the need to know what existed beyond the edge of the map. I can see them in my mind, these ships setting out from harbors in Portugal and Spain, from England and the Netherlands, from Venice and Genoa, each one carrying not just cargo and crew, but also the accumulated knowledge of everyone who had sailed before. The collected wisdom of Mediterranean sailors and Arab navigators, of Viking seafarers and Polynesian wayfinders, all of that experience compressed into sailing techniques and navigation methods, into the angle of a sail and the reading of stars. The stars, those fixed points in the turning sky, became the language of direction when all other reference points disappeared, when land sank below the horizon and left only water in every direction. The sailors learned to read the heavens like a text, to find latitude in the height of Polaris above the horizon, to mark time by the progression of constellations across the night, to navigate by celestial permanence through terrestrial uncertainty. And there were other signs, subtler indicators that required patience and attention, the color of the water changing as depth decreased, the appearance of certain birds that never strayed far from land, the smell of vegetation carried on the wind, seaweed floating in particular patterns. All of these small details became significant, became the difference between finding land and sailing past it, between survival and disappearance. I find myself thinking about the silence that must have filled the long middle portions of these voyages, the days and weeks when nothing changed, when the routine of shipboard life simply repeated, watch after watch, the same faces, the same tasks, the same horizon in every direction, and in that repetition, in that sameness, the human mind begins to wonder, begins to question, begins to imagine what might be waiting just beyond the next sunrise. The urge to explore did not begin suddenly. It grew slowly, like a tide that rises so gradually you only notice it when the shoreline has completely changed. And if we trace this tide backward, if we follow it to its sources, we find ourselves in the Mediterranean world of the 13th and 14th centuries, where the foundations were being laid for journeys that would transform everything. The Italian city-states hummed with a particular kind of energy in those years, Venice and Genoa especially, their warehouses filled with goods that had traveled impossible distances, silks from China, spices from the islands of the East Indies. These items arrived through a complex chain of intermediaries, passing from hand to hand across thousands of miles, each transaction adding cost, adding mystery, adding desire. The merchants who handled these goods knew only fragments of the full story. They knew that pepper came from somewhere far to the east, that cinnamon arrived by routes they could not fully trace, that the prices they paid to Arab and Persian middlemen represented just one link in a long chain of exchange. And this fragmentary knowledge created a hunger, a need to understand the full geography of trade, to find the sources, to cut out the intermediaries and claim the profits for themselves. But the world as it was then understood presented significant barriers. The Mediterranean opened onto the Atlantic, but the Atlantic seemed to lead nowhere. The African coast stretched southward, but how far it went and where it ended remained unknown. And to the west lay only open ocean, empty and threatening, decorated on maps with warnings and speculation. The maps themselves tell us something about the limits of knowledge in this period. The Portolan charts used by Mediterranean sailors were remarkably accurate for the coastlines they knew. Detailed renderings of harbors and headlands, carefully noted depths and distances, but beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, beyond the familiar shores, the certainty dissolved into conjecture. There were stories, always stories, fragments of ancient knowledge mixed with medieval invention, tales of Saint Brendan the Navigator, who supposedly sailed west and found islands of paradise, accounts from Pliny and other classical authors describing distant lands and strange peoples. And these stories mingled with Christian cosmology and classical geography to create a worldview that was part observation, part inheritance, part imagination. Portugal emerged as an unlikely center for the systematic push beyond these boundaries, a small kingdom on the western edge of Europe, facing the Atlantic, with limited agricultural land and a population that had learned to supplement farming with fishing, with looking outward toward the sea rather than inward toward the continent. Prince Henry, later called the Navigator, though he himself never sailed on these voyages, established something like a center of maritime knowledge at Sagres, on the southwestern tip of Portugal, where the land ends and the Atlantic begins. And here he gathered map makers and ship designers, astronomers and sailors, creating a space where theoretical knowledge could meet practical experience. The challenge was both technical and psychological. The ships of the early 1400s were designed for Mediterranean conditions, for relatively short distances between ports, for seas where you were rarely out of sight of land for long. The traditional round-hulled merchant vessels, the galleys powered by oars and sail, these were not adequate for extended ocean voyages into unknown waters. Gradually, through experimentation and modification, a new type of vessel emerged, the caravel, smaller than the great merchant ships but more maneuverable, equipped with lateen sails that allowed it to sail closer to the wind, capable of exploring coastlines and rivers, of turning back against prevailing winds, of handling the conditions that Atlantic exploration demanded. The Portuguese captains began to push southward along the African coast, moving incrementally, each voyage extending the known world by another degree, another 100 miles. Cape Bojador became a significant psychological barrier, a point beyond which sailors feared to pass, where the water was said to boil, where currents would prevent any return, where the world itself might end in catastrophe. Gil Eanes finally passed Cape Bojador in 1434 and found that the ocean beyond was simply more ocean. The water did not boil. The currents could be managed. The world continued, and this discovery, this proof that fear had been exaggerated, opened the way for further progress. The voyages continued, year after year, decade after decade, each captain carrying instructions to go beyond the point where the previous expedition had turned back, to add new information to the growing body of knowledge, to mark the coastline and note the currents, to observe the stars from new latitudes and record what they found. They began to notice patterns, the way the wind blew from certain directions at certain times of year, the existence of currents that could carry a ship far from shore, but might also provide a route home. The volta do mar, the turn of the sea, became a crucial discovery. The realization that to sail south along the African coast and then return A ship should not simply reverse its outbound route, but instead swing far out into the Atlantic, catching different winds that would bring it back to Portugal. This was knowledge purchased with time and risk, with ships that did not return, with crews that died of scurvy or thirst, or simple exhaustion, with the slow accumulation of information about winds and currents, about coastlines and anchorages, about where fresh water could be found and where hostile forces might be encountered. The Portuguese established small fortified posts along the African coast, not colonies in the later sense, but trading stations, places where contact could be made with local populations, where gold and ivory and eventually enslaved people could be acquired, where the theoretical goal of reaching the Indies by sailing around Africa could be pursued alongside the immediate profits of African trade. Bartolomeo Diaz rounded the southern tip of Africa in 1488, pushed by storms into open water, losing sight of the land, and then finding land again to his north and east, realizing that he had passed some crucial turning point, that the continent had ended, that the way to the Indian Ocean lay open, though he called the point the Cape of Storms. Recognizing the violence of the waters where the Atlantic and Indian Oceans met, King João of Portugal renamed it the Cape of Good Hope, emphasizing possibility rather than danger, looking forward to the completion of the route that his predecessors had sought for nearly a century, the water route to the Indies that would bypass the Mediterranean, that would break the monopoly of the middlemen, that would bring the spices and silks directly to Portuguese ships. But before that route could be fully exploited, before Vasco da Gama could sail around Africa and across to India, another development had occurred, one that would eventually prove even more significant than the African route. Christopher Columbus, a Genoese sailor who had spent years seeking patronage for a different plan, finally convinced the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella to support his vision, his conviction that by sailing west across the Atlantic, by following the latitude line, he could reach the Indies more directly than any route around Africa could provide. Columbus was wrong about the distances, dramatically wrong. The Arab geographers he dismissed had more accurate measurements of the Earth's circumference, but his error was providential, because where he expected to find the coast of Asia after 3,000 miles of sailing, he instead encountered islands and continents that no European had systematically explored, lands that would eventually be called the New World, though they were, of course, not new to the millions of people already living there. The first voyage in 1492 lasted just over 2 months of actual Atlantic crossing, from the Canary Islands to the Bahamas, and in that time the crew experienced what would become familiar to later ocean voyagers: the terror of complete separation from land, the claustrophobia of the ship's small world, the uncertainty about distance and direction, the fear that the captain's calculations might be wrong, that they might sail until their supplies ran out and die of thirst with no land in sight. Columbus kept 2 logs, 1 true record and 1 false record that understated the distance traveled, meant to prevent the crew from panicking at how far they had come from Spain, how far they would have to sail to return. And this deception speaks to the psychological challenge of these voyages, the way fear and uncertainty could overwhelm even experienced sailors when land disappeared and only water remained in every direction for weeks on end. The landfall in the Bahamas changed everything, not immediately, but in its implications. in what it meant for the European understanding of geography, for the possibilities of wealth and conquest, for the future of millions of people in the Americas who would face the consequences of this contact. Columbus believed until his death that he had reached the outskirts of Asia, that the islands he explored were part of the Indies, that the mainland coasts he touched on later voyages were extensions of China or India. He died without fully understanding what he had encountered, without grasping that an entirely separate landmass existed between Europe and Asia. Other explorers would begin to piece together the truth. Amerigo Vespucci, whose name would eventually be given to the continents, recognized that this was indeed a new world, separate from Asia, and map makers began the slow process of adjusting their understanding, of adding these new coastlines to their charts, of trying to determine where this new world ended and whether a passage might exist through it to the Asian markets that remained the ultimate goal. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 divided the world between Spain and Portugal, drawing a line through the Atlantic, assigning everything to the east to Portugal and everything to the west to Spain, an act of breathtaking presumption, two European kingdoms claiming the right to divide the entire globe between them based on the authority of the Pope, with no consideration for the people already living in the territories being allocated. This division of the unknown, this carving up of territories that had not yet been explored, set the pattern for what would follow. And in the decades after 1494, Spanish and Portuguese expeditions fanned out across the Atlantic and beyond, each voyage adding fragments to the growing picture of what the world actually contained. The Spanish focused on the lands Columbus had encountered, sending expedition after expedition to the Caribbean, to the mainland coasts of Central and South America, and what they found there exceeded their expectations in ways both wonderful and terrible. Civilizations of sophisticated complexity, cities larger than most European capitals, agricultural systems that supported millions of people, astronomical knowledge, architectural achievements, artistic traditions of remarkable subtlety. Hernán Cortés encountered the Aztec Empire in 1519, arriving in a world of causeways and canals, of floating gardens and massive pyramids, of a capital city, Tenochtitlan, that held perhaps 200,000 people, with markets that displayed goods from across Mesoamerica, with social hierarchies and religious practices and political structures that had developed over centuries without any European influence. The encounter was not one of primitive meeting advanced, but of different meeting different. The Spanish had advantages in certain technologies, steel weapons and horses and eventually disease, while the Aztecs had advantages in numbers and knowledge of the terrain and complex diplomatic relationships with surrounding peoples. What followed was not inevitable conquest, but rather a process of alliance and betrayal, of epidemic disease that killed millions, of political maneuvering and violent conflict that eventually resulted in Spanish control. Further south, Francisco Pizarro encountered the Inca Empire, a realm that stretched for thousands of miles along the western coast of South America, connected by road systems that crossed mountains and deserts, administered through a complex bureaucracy, sustained by agricultural terracing and irrigation systems that transformed steep mountainsides into productive farmland, organized around a divine ruler and a cosmology that saw no separation between the political and the sacred. The Spanish conquistadors were not scientists or anthropologists. They were adventurers and soldiers, seeking wealth and status, operating with a worldview that saw non-Christian peoples as legitimate targets for conquest, and they documented what they found through that lens, producing accounts that mixed accurate observation with prejudice and misunderstanding, describing cities and customs and battles with a perspective that justified their own actions, while revealing fragments of the worlds they were destroying. Meanwhile, the Portuguese finally completed the route that their explorers had been seeking for nearly a century. Vasco da Gama sailed around the Cape of Good Hope in 1497, crossed the Indian Ocean with the help of an Arab pilot, and reached Calicut on the southwest coast of India in 1498, establishing direct contact with the spice markets that had been the ultimate goal all along. The Indian Ocean was not an empty frontier. It was a space of ancient trade routes, of established commercial networks linking East Africa and Arabia and India and the islands of Southeast Asia, of monsoon winds that dictated sailing seasons, of merchant communities and port cities and cultural exchanges that had been functioning for centuries before the first Portuguese ship arrived. The Portuguese entered this world as disruptors, using their ships as weapons, their cannons giving them advantages in naval combat that allowed them to seize control of strategic ports and demand access to trade, establishing a network of fortified trading posts from Mozambique to Malacca, from Hormuz to Goa, creating an empire not of territorial control but of maritime dominance, of control over sea lanes and harbors rather than land and populations. Alfonso de Albuquerque captured Goa in 1510 and made it the center of Portuguese operations in Asia, captured Malacca in 1511, gaining control over the strait through which much of the spice trade passed, attempted to capture Aden to control access to the Red Sea, and in doing so demonstrated the Portuguese strategy not to conquer vast territories, but to control the choke points, the places where control over shipping could translate into control over commerce. The world was revealing itself to be both larger and more interconnected than European geography had imagined. The continents were separate but not isolated. Goods and ideas and people had been moving between Africa and Asia, and Europe and the Americas, for far longer than the explorers understood. And the age of European exploration was not the discovery of empty spaces, but rather the violent insertion of European power into networks and systems that already existed. Ferdinand Magellan conceived a plan even more ambitious than reaching India by sailing east. He proposed to reach the Spice Islands by sailing west, to find a passage through or around the American continents, and then cross the Pacific to circumnavigate the entire globe and prove finally and definitively what its true dimensions were, what relationship the continents had to each other, whether the world was indeed a sphere that could be sailed around. The expedition departed Spain in 1519 with 5 ships and approximately 270 men, and what followed was one of the most harrowing journeys in the history of exploration. Months spent searching for a passage through South America, finally finding a strait at the continent's southern tip, threading through channels between icy cliffs, losing ships to storms and desertion, emerging finally into an ocean so vast that Magellan named it Pacific, peaceful, though the crossing would prove anything but peaceful for the men who attempted it. The Pacific crossing took far longer than Magellan had anticipated. The ocean was wider than European geography had allowed for, and the fleet sailed for month after month across empty water, running out of fresh food, reduced to eating leather and rats, suffering from scurvy as their bodies broke down from lack of vitamin C, men dying and being buried at sea, the ships themselves deteriorating, sails rotting, rigging failing, the entire expedition balanced on the edge of catastrophe. They finally reached the Philippines in 1521, and there Magellan involved himself in local politics, allied himself with one ruler against another, and died in a skirmish on the beach at Mactan, killed by warriors led by Lapu-Lapu, demonstrating that European technology and tactics did not guarantee victory, that the explorers and conquistadors were mortal and vulnerable, that the people they encountered could and did resist. The expedition continued without Magellan, reduced now to 3 ships and fewer than 150 men, reaching the Spice Islands, loading cargo, and then facing the question of how to return. One ship attempted to sail back across the Pacific but failed, turned back by storms and adverse winds. Another ship stayed in the Spice Islands. Only the Victoria, under the command of Juan Sebastian Elcano, managed to sail across the Indian Ocean, around the Cape of Good Hope, and back to Spain. The Victoria arrived in September of 1522, 3 years after departure, with only 18 of the original crew still alive, carrying a cargo of cloves and cinnamon valuable enough to pay for the entire expedition. But more valuable than the spices was the knowledge they brought back, the proof that the earth could be circumnavigated, that the Pacific was indeed an ocean and not a narrow sea, that the world was far larger than the classical geographers had calculated. The map makers now had to reconfigure their understanding completely, to fit together the pieces of a coastline that different expeditions had traced, to acknowledge the vast scale of the Pacific, to show 2 separate continents in the Western Hemisphere, to indicate the distances and relationships that were becoming clearer with each returning ship. English and French expeditions began to probe the northern coastlines of the Americas, searching for a northwest passage, a route that might lead through or around North America to the Pacific and the riches of Asia. John Cabot sailed to Newfoundland in 1497. Jacques Cartier explored the St. Lawrence River in the 1530s. These northern waters offered fish in abundance, the Grand Banks teeming with cod, but they did not offer the easy passage to Asia that the explorers sought. The search for this passage would continue for centuries, drawing expedition after expedition into the Arctic, into waters choked with ice, into channels that seemed promising but led only to dead ends. The geography of the northern route was complex and dangerous, and the Northwest Passage would not be successfully navigated until the early 20th century, long after its commercial value had disappeared. But the search itself was productive in other ways. It mapped coastlines. It established claims to territory. It brought back knowledge of lands and peoples and resources. It created the foundation for later colonization and exploitation. The fishing fleets that would harvest the Grand Banks, the fur trade that would draw Europeans deep into the interior of North America, the eventual settlement that would displace and destroy indigenous populations. The Spanish pushed northward from Mexico, exploring what would become the southwestern United States, searching for cities of gold that existed only in rumor and imagination. Francisco Vázquez de Coronado led an expedition through present-day Arizona and New Mexico and Kansas in 1540 and 1541, finding pueblos and plains and the Grand Canyon, finding peoples who had lived in these regions for thousands of years, but not finding the golden cities that had motivated the journey. These failures to find imaginary wealth did not stop the expeditions. Each disappointing result was simply reinterpreted. The gold must be further north, further west, in the next valley, beyond the next range of mountains. And so the exploration continued, driven by hope and greed, and the conviction that somewhere in this vast new world there must be riches comparable to what the Spanish had found in Mexico and Peru. The English privateers began to challenge Spanish dominance in the later 16th century. Francis Drake circumnavigated the globe between 1577 and 1580, raiding Spanish settlements along the Pacific coast of the Americas, claiming California for England, demonstrating that Spanish control of these waters was not absolute, that other nations could and would contest for access and profit. Drake's voyage was both exploration and piracy, mapping and plundering, adding to geographical knowledge while also seizing Spanish gold and silver. His ship, the Golden Hind, returned to England laden with treasure, and Drake himself became a symbol of English maritime ambition, of the possibility that a smaller nation could challenge Spanish and Portuguese dominance through superior seamanship and daring. The Dutch entered the competition as well, building on their experience as traders and shipbuilders, creating the Dutch East India Company in 1602, a corporation granted monopoly rights to Dutch trade in Asia, equipped with the power to make treaties and wage war, to establish colonies and administer justice, essentially functioning as a state within a state, pursuing profit through any means necessary. The Dutch focused their efforts on the East Indies, on the islands that produced nutmeg and cloves and other spices, displacing the Portuguese from many of their strongholds, establishing Batavia, modern Jakarta, as the center of their Asian operations, creating a network of trade and control that would persist for centuries, that would make the Netherlands enormously wealthy, even as the human cost in the colonized territories was staggering. Willem Janszoon reached the coast of Australia in 1606, the first confirmed European landing on the continent, though he did not recognize it as a separate landmass, thought it was part of New Guinea, and the Dutch would continue to encounter the western and northern coasts of Australia throughout the 17th century without finding anything that seemed valuable enough to justify colonization. Abel Tasman circumnavigated Australia without actually seeing the eastern coast, proving it was an island continent, discovering Tasmania and New Zealand in 1642 and 1643, encountering the Maori, describing lands and peoples that would later become targets for British colonization, but again finding nothing that attracted immediate Dutch interest, no spices, no obvious sources of wealth, just coastlines and indigenous populations and territories that seemed difficult and unrewarding. The English and French established rival claims in North America, creating colonies that survived through tremendous hardship. Jamestown in 1607, Plymouth in 1620, Quebec in 1608. These settlements represented a different model of colonization than the Spanish had pursued, Not conquest of existing empires, but rather the establishment of agricultural colonies, the displacement of indigenous peoples to create European societies transplanted to new soil. The colonists faced starvation and disease, conflict with indigenous populations who recognized these settlements as invasions, winters that killed those unprepared for the climate, summers that brought malaria and dysentery. The early years of these colonies saw mortality rates of 50% or higher, saw desperate struggles for survival, saw the gradual realization that this was not going to be easy, that the land would not simply yield its wealth, that success would require adaptation and endurance and often violence. The fur trade drew French explorers deep into the interior of North America, following rivers and lakes, establishing relationships with indigenous nations, learning to travel by canoe and snowshoe, to survive in environments completely different from anything in Europe. Samuel de Champlain mapped the St. Lawrence and the Great Lakes in the early 1600s, creating alliances with Huron and Algonquin peoples, involving himself in their conflicts with the Iroquois Confederacy, beginning patterns of alliance and warfare that would shape North American history for the next 2 centuries. The English Hudson's Bay Company received its charter in 1670, claiming rights to all the territory drained by rivers flowing into Hudson Bay, a vast area that included much of what would become Canada. And the company established trading posts where indigenous trappers could exchange furs for European goods, creating economic relationships that transformed indigenous societies, that introduced new technologies and new dependencies, that disrupted traditional ways of life in exchange for cloth and metal tools and guns. The Pacific remained the least explored of the world's oceans into the 18th century, its vast distances and scattered islands making systematic exploration difficult. But gradually the picture filled in. Russian explorers pushed eastward across Siberia, reached the Pacific coast, explored the Aleutian Islands and Alaska, establishing claims that would eventually lead to Russian settlements as far south as California. James Cook made 3 great voyages of Pacific exploration between 1768 and 1779, mapping New Zealand and the eastern coast of Australia, exploring the Hawaiian Islands, searching for the theoretical southern continent that geographers believed must exist to balance the land masses of the northern hemisphere, proving that no such continent existed at habitable latitudes, charting islands and reefs and coastlines with unprecedented accuracy. Cook's expeditions were scientific as well as geographical, carrying astronomers to observe the transit of Venus, collecting botanical specimens, documenting indigenous peoples and their cultures with more care than earlier explorers had shown, though this documentation was still filtered through European assumptions and prejudices, still part of a larger project of claiming and categorizing and ultimately controlling. Cook died in Hawaii in 1779, killed in a confrontation that arose from misunderstandings and escalating tensions, his death coming in the same islands where he had been welcomed months earlier, demonstrating again the fragility of these encounters, the way initial cooperation could collapse into violence, the consequences of cultural misunderstanding when backed by firearms and ships. By the end of the 18th century, the general outlines of world geography were known to Europeans. The continents had been mapped, the major islands located, the coastlines traced with increasing accuracy. What remained were the interiors, The vast territories of Africa and Asia and the Americas, where European knowledge was still fragmentary or absent, where indigenous peoples maintained their independence and their own geographical understanding, where the map still showed blank spaces waiting to be filled, but the nature of exploration was changing. The early period of dramatic discovery was over. No more unknown continents would be found, no more ocean crossings into complete uncertainty. What remained was detailed survey work, the filling in of particulars, the establishment of precise latitudes and longitudes, the creation of maps that could serve imperial administration and commercial exploitation. The motivations had clarified as well. The romantic idea of exploration for its own sake, the desire to know what lay beyond the horizon. These had always been secondary to more material concerns. The search for wealth and trade routes, for souls to convert and territories to claim, for advantage over rival nations and access to resources. And by the late 18th century, these material motivations were completely dominant. The interior of Africa became a particular focus. The coastlines had been known for centuries. Trading posts and slave forts dotted the shores. But the vast interior remained unknown to Europeans, protected by disease, by difficult terrain, by powerful kingdoms that had their own reasons for limiting European access. The Niger River's course was uncertain. The location of Timbuktu was disputed. The source of the Nile remained one of geography's great mysteries. European explorers began to penetrate these interiors in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Mungo Park traced portions of the Niger. Dying on his second expedition, Richard Burton and John Hanning Speke searched for the source of the Nile, their expedition ending in bitter dispute over which lake they had found. David Livingstone crossed the continent multiple times, disappearing for years, found by Henry Morton Stanley in a meeting that became famous, though perhaps apocryphal, in its details. These explorations were preludes to colonization. The geographical knowledge they produced would be used to justify and enable the European partition of Africa in the late 19th century, the drawing of borders that ignored existing political structures and cultural boundaries, the division of the continent among European powers in a scramble for territory and resources that would have devastating consequences lasting to the present day. The same pattern played out elsewhere: geographical knowledge serving imperial expansion, maps becoming tools of control, the blank spaces on the map not representing absence of knowledge, but rather absence of European knowledge. Indigenous peoples had their own maps, their own geographical understanding, their own names for rivers and mountains and regions, but these were systematically displaced by European cartography, replaced by names chosen by explorers and administrators, by borders drawn in European capitals. The age of exploration as it had begun in the 15th century was effectively over by the mid-19th century. The world had been circumnavigated, the continents located, the major geographical features identified. What followed was not exploration, but rather survey and conquest, the detailed mapping that serves administration, the resource assessment that serves extraction, the establishment of control over territories and peoples. And yet something had been learned in those centuries of voyaging. The world was indeed round, could be sailed around. The continents were separate, but connected by oceans that could be crossed. The peoples of the world were diverse, but recognizably human, practicing agriculture and building cities and creating art and developing philosophies and governing themselves according to their own systems. The exploration had revealed not European superiority, but rather human commonality, though this lesson was largely ignored by those who preferred conquest to understanding. The ships themselves deserve consideration. These wooden vessels that made the journeys possible, built from trees that had grown for decades or centuries, shaped by hands that understood the relationship between grain and strength, between curve and speed, between weight and stability. Each ship a synthesis of accumulated knowledge, of trial and error spanning generations. A caravel under construction was a beautiful thing, the ribs rising like the skeleton of some great creature, the planks fitted and caulked, the deck laid, the masts stepped, and finally the sails, canvas woven from flax or hemp, cut and sewn to catch the wind, to translate invisible air into forward motion, into the power that could carry a ship across thousands of miles of ocean. The sailors who crewed these vessels lived in conditions of remarkable hardship, sleeping in cramped quarters below deck, eating food that deteriorated over the course of long voyages, hardtack that became infested with weevils, salt meat that turned rancid, water that grew brackish and foul, the monotony of the shipboard routine broken only by storms, and the constant work of maintaining the vessel, repairing sails, splicing rope, pumping bilge water, and yet they signed on voyage after voyage. These men, drawn by wages or adventure, or the simple need for employment, by the possibility of prize money if they sailed with privateers, by the hope of returning with stories and status, by the camaraderie of shipboard life. The bonds formed between people who depend absolutely on each other for survival. The navigation was an art as much as a science, the instruments imperfect, the astrolabe and cross-staff, and later the sextant, tools for measuring angles between celestial bodies and the horizon, for determining latitude with reasonable accuracy, but longitude remained uncertain until the development of reliable chronometers in the 18th century, until time could be carried accurately across the oceans, allowing the calculation of distance east or west. Before chronometers, longitude was estimated, dead reckoning they called it, tracking speed and direction, accounting for currents and drift, accepting that error would accumulate. That position was always somewhat uncertain, and the navigators learned to read other signs, the color of water indicating depth and the presence of birds suggesting land, the smell of vegetation on the wind. All the subtle indicators that experience taught them to notice and interpret. The cultural exchanges that resulted from these explorations were complex and multi-directional, not simply Europeans imposing their ways on the rest of the world, though that certainly happened, but also Europeans adopting and adapting, learning to eat maize and potatoes and tomatoes, crops that would transform European agriculture, learning to use hammocks and canoes, practical technologies developed by indigenous peoples, learning words and concepts that had no European equivalents. The Columbian Exchange, as historians call it, involved the transfer of plants and animals and diseases between hemispheres, horses and cattle and pigs spreading through the Americas, transforming indigenous ways of life, enabling new forms of transportation and warfare and food production, while American crops, potatoes and maize especially, spread through Europe and Asia and Africa, eventually feeding populations that could not have been sustained without them. But the exchange also involved smallpox and measles and typhus, diseases that swept through indigenous populations with devastating effect, killing millions who had no immunity, depopulating entire regions, creating demographic catastrophes that exceeded anything in European experience, that made conquest easier because the populations being conquered had already been decimated by invisible enemies they could not fight. The mixing of populations that resulted from exploration and colonization created new cultures, Creole languages blending European and African and indigenous elements, musical traditions that fused different rhythms and instruments and scales, cuisines that combined ingredients and techniques from multiple continents, religious practices that merged Catholic saints with African or indigenous deities, creating syncretic traditions that were genuinely new, that belonged fully to none of the parent cultures, but rather to the particular circumstances of colonial encounter. The philosophical implications of the discoveries were profound. The realization that the classical authorities had been wrong about the size of the earth, that entire continents existed unknown to Ptolemy and Pliny, that human societies had developed in complete isolation from the Mediterranean world, following different trajectories, creating different solutions to common problems. This challenged European certainty about the universality of their own traditions and truths, and yet this challenge was largely deflected, absorbed into narratives of European superiority, the diversity of human cultures reinterpreted as a hierarchy, with European civilization at the apex and other peoples arranged below, according to their supposed level of development. The exploration that could have taught humility instead fed arrogance. The encounter that could have generated mutual learning instead justified domination. The maps tell this story in their own way. The early charts, with their blank spaces and speculative coastlines, gradually filling with detail, with names chosen by explorers, with borders that would become the foundations of colonial empires, the geography becoming fixed, codified, turned into something that could be owned and administered and exploited. But there were always other maps, indigenous maps that showed different features, that organized space according to different principles, that marked sacred sites and seasonal movements and kinship territories. These maps were rarely recorded in forms that survived, but they existed in memory and practice, in the way people moved through their lands, in the stories they told about places and the relationships between them. The age of exploration transformed the world, connected populations that had been separate, initiated processes of exchange and conquest that continue to shape the present, created the foundations of global trade and global inequality, of cultural mixture and cultural destruction, of scientific knowledge and imperial violence, all of these things tangled together, inseparable in their origins, even as we might wish to celebrate some aspects while condemning others. And so I find myself back at the harbor where this reflection began, watching the water move against the pilings, listening to the creak of wood and rope, thinking about all the voyages that started from places like this, all the departures into uncertainty, all the knowledge gained and the costs paid for that knowledge. The light is different now, the sun higher. The quality of the illumination changed from that liminal dawn moment, but the essential character of the place remains, this threshold between land and sea, between the known and the unknown, between what we carry with us and what we might find beyond the horizon. I think about the courage required, not the mindless courage of recklessness, but the courage that acknowledges fear and proceeds anyway, that understands the risks and accepts them, that knows the voyage might end in death, but chooses to sail regardless. This courage animated the expeditions, whatever we might think of their purposes, whatever judgment we pass on their consequences. And I think about the curiosity, the desire to know, to see what lies beyond, to understand how the pieces fit together. This curiosity is fundamentally human, appears in every culture, in every period. The stories of exploration exist in every tradition, not just European. The Polynesian navigators who settled the Pacific Islands, the Arab merchants who crossed the Indian Ocean, the Chinese fleets that reached East Africa. The human impulse to explore transcends any particular culture or moment. The water continues its eternal movement, rising and falling with the tide, moving with currents that flow according to their own logic, indifferent to human purposes, indifferent to the ships that cross its surface, indifferent to the civilizations that rise and fall along its shores. And there is something comforting in this indifference, in the reminder that the natural world operates according to principles that predate and will outlast all human endeavor. I watch a bird. I cannot tell what species from this distance, gliding low over the water, its wings outstretched and motionless, riding the air currents with effortless grace. And I think about how this bird navigates, how it knows where it is going, what internal compass guides it, what combination of instinct and learning and observation allows it to move so confidently through its element. The human navigators had to learn what the bird knows innately, had to develop tools and techniques to replace the natural abilities they lacked, had to chart the stars and measure angles and record observations, had to build understanding through accumulated experience, through mistakes and corrections, through the slow process of turning mystery into knowledge. The shadows are lengthening now, the day moving toward evening, and the quality of the light becomes golden, softer than the bright clarity of midday, more forgiving, the kind of light that makes everything seem gentler, more distant, as if the hard edges of the world are dissolving into possibility. I imagine the sailors in their final hours before departure, saying goodbye to people they might never see again, carrying the weight of all the things left unsaid, all the ordinary moments they would miss, all the births and deaths and daily dramas of the communities they were leaving, carrying this weight along with their sea chests and their hopes and their fears, stepping aboard vessels that would become their entire world for months or years. And I imagine them years later, the survivors, returning to harbors that had changed in their absence, stepping onto docks that felt foreign after so long at sea, carrying memories of things they could barely describe, of lands and peoples so different from anything their listeners had experienced that the stories must have seemed like fiction, like tales from some romance or legend, rather than accounts of actual places and events. The gaps between experience and communication, between what was seen and what could be told, these gaps must have been vast. How do you explain the scale of the Pacific to someone who has never left the Mediterranean? How do you describe the jungle or the desert or the ice? How do you convey the terror of a storm at sea, the wonder of an unknown shore? The complex humanity of people who live according to completely different assumptions. The light fades further, the sun dropping toward the horizon, and the water takes on the colors of the sky, blues and purples and hints of orange, the whole scene becoming softer, quieter, as if the world itself is settling into rest after the exertions of the day. I think about all the knowledge that was lost, all the indigenous understanding that was never recorded, all the navigational expertise and ecological wisdom and historical memory that disappeared when populations were decimated, when languages died, when oral traditions were interrupted. The exploration added to European knowledge, but it also subtracted from human knowledge, destroyed as much as it discovered, and this loss is incalculable, permanent, irretrievable. The stars are beginning to appear now, faint points of light in the deepening blue, and I think about how these same stars guided the navigators, how celestial permanence served terrestrial wandering, how the fixed patterns of the heavens allowed humanity to chart the changes of the earth. This relationship between the eternal and the temporal, between what persists and what passes, between the stars that remain and the voyages that end. The water darkens, the details disappearing into shadow, leaving only the essential forms, the line between sea and sky, the silhouettes of distant ships, the slow rhythm of waves against the shore. And in this simplification, in this reduction to essentials, there is a kind of peace, a quieting of the constant analysis, a return to simple presence, to being here, now, at the edge of the sea, where so many journeys began. There is a place far above the world where the night never truly falls and the day never truly ends, where the curve of the earth unfolds beneath like a vast and breathing tapestry, blue and white and swirling, endless in its turning. It is a place built by human hands, assembled piece by piece in the absolute silence of space, where 15 nations came together with a vision that stretched beyond borders and languages, beyond the weight of history and the pull of gravity itself. And what they built there, what they continue to maintain, is something that has circled the planet more than 100,000 times, tracing an invisible thread around the globe, a testament to what becomes possible when minds align toward a singular purpose. The International Space Station, a laboratory, a home, a point of light moving across the darkness, traveling at 17,500 miles per hour, so fast that it witnesses 16 sunrises and 16 sunsets in a single Earth day. Yet inside, time moves differently, measured not in the rhythm of day and night, but in the slow and deliberate work of discovery, in the quiet hum of machinery, in the gentle floating of objects suspended in the absence of weight. To understand this place, to truly grasp what it represents, one must first imagine the scale of such an undertaking, because the station that exists now, gleaming and intricate against the black, did not appear all at once. It grew, module by module, year by year, each component launched from the surface of the earth, carried upward on pillars of fire, guided by calculations so precise that even the smallest error could mean catastrophe. And before the first piece ever left the ground, before the first weld was made or the first blueprint drawn, there were decades of dreaming, of planning, of failed attempts and hard-won lessons, because humanity's desire to live among the stars is not new. It reaches back through generations, through the early rocket pioneers who looked upward and wondered, through the Cold War competition that drove nations to prove their technological might, through the gradual realization that some achievements are simply too vast for any single country to accomplish alone. The station floats now at an altitude of roughly 250 miles above the surface, in what is called low Earth orbit, close enough that the planet still dominates the view, close enough that its atmosphere creates just enough drag to require periodic boosts to maintain altitude, yet far enough that the pull of gravity is reduced to a gentle whisper, creating the conditions for what those aboard experience as weightlessness, though gravity itself has not disappeared, merely transformed into a constant state of falling around the Earth, never quite reaching it from the ground on a clear night, away from the glow of city lights. The station can be seen with the naked eye, a bright point moving steadily across the constellation patterns, brighter than most stars, persistent in its trajectory. And for those who know when and where to look, there is something profound in that silent passage, in knowing that within that moving light, there are people living and working, conducting experiments that may one day change the course of human understanding. The structure itself, if one could see it up close, would reveal a complexity of form that defies simple description. Solar arrays, stretching outward like great golden wings, radiators gleaming white, modules connected in a configuration that has evolved over the years, each addition carefully planned, each connection a triumph of engineering, and inside, the corridors and chambers where astronauts and cosmonauts move through their days, where they eat and sleep and work and gaze out of windows at the planet turning below, at the storms forming over oceans, at the lights of cities spreading across continents, at the aurora flickering green and purple along the magnetic field lines. This is where the story begins, not with a single moment, but with the accumulation of countless moments, decisions made in offices and laboratories, agreements signed across negotiating tables, risks taken by those willing to strap themselves to rockets, and the slow, patient, relentless work of building something that has never existed before, something that hovers now in the space between Earth and the infinite, a place where the boundary between nations blurs, where the shared effort of exploration creates bonds stronger than the forces that might otherwise divide. To trace the origins of this floating outpost, one must travel backward through time, past the gleaming modules and advanced life support systems, past the modern era of international cooperation, into a period when the very idea of maintaining a permanent presence in space seemed to belong more to the realm of science fiction than practical reality. The dream began, as so many great endeavors do, with visionaries who refused to accept the limits of their time in the decades following the Second World War. When rocket technology developed for weapons began to hint at possibilities beyond destruction, scientists and engineers in different corners of the world started to imagine what might be accomplished if humanity could break free from the surface of the Earth, not for minutes or hours, but for days, weeks, months, indefinitely. In the Soviet Union, designer Konstantin Tsiolkovsky had written decades earlier about multi-stage rockets and orbital stations, his equations mapping theoretical paths into the cosmos. And in America, Werner von Braun sketched concepts for rotating wheels in space that would generate artificial gravity through centrifugal force. These ideas circulated through magazines and technical journals, capturing imaginations. planting seeds that would take decades to germinate. The reality, however, proved far more challenging than the dreams, because before anyone could live in space, they first had to reach it. And that achievement came in 1957 when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, a sphere of polished metal no larger than a beach ball, carrying radio transmitters that beeped their signal back to Earth, announcing that humanity had finally placed an object in orbit, that the age of space flight had begun. What followed was a period of intense competition, the space race, driven by Cold War tensions and national pride, each superpower racing to demonstrate technological superiority. The Soviets sent the first human, Yuri Gagarin, circling the Earth in 1961. America responded with Project Mercury, then Gemini, building the knowledge and skills needed for longer missions. And all the while, both nations were learning the fundamental truth that space is an unforgiving environment, that every system must work flawlessly, that human survival beyond the atmosphere requires constant vigilance. The first space stations were Soviet achievements, small, primitive by modern standards, but revolutionary in their time. Salyut 1 launched in 1971, a single module about the size of a large bus, equipped with basic living quarters and scientific instruments. Its name meant salute in Russian, a tribute to Gagarin, who had died 4 years earlier in a plane crash. And though its first crew perished during re-entry when a valve failed and their capsule depressurized, the station itself proved the concept. Humans could live and work in orbit, could conduct experiments impossible on Earth's surface. More Salyut stations followed, each iteration improving on the last, solving problems of life support, of food storage, of exercise equipment to prevent muscle atrophy in weightlessness. Cosmonauts learned to adapt to their floating environment, learned to sleep while strapped to walls, learned to eat from tubes and sealed containers, learned to wash with wet cloths in a place where water does not pour but forms floating spheres. America pursued a different path, launching Skylab in 1973, a station built from a converted Saturn V rocket stage, massive compared to the Salyut series, with a volume large enough for astronauts to move freely, to conduct experiments in solar physics and Earth observation, to test how the human body responded to extended periods in microgravity. 3 crews visited Skylab over the course of a year, the final mission lasting 84 days, and they discovered both the challenges and the unexpected joys of orbital life. The way food floated playfully in the cabin, the spectacular views of Earth that never grew old, the strange sensation of sleeping without the pressure of a mattress beneath them. But Skylab was always meant to be temporary. Budget cuts and shifting priorities meant no follow-up missions. And in 1979, the station fell from orbit, breaking apart over the Indian Ocean and Western Australia, pieces scattered across the desert, a reminder that everything in low Earth orbit eventually succumbs to atmospheric drag without periodic boosts to maintain altitude. The Soviets, meanwhile, continued to refine their approach. In 1986, they launched the core module of Mir, whose name means both peace and world in Russian, and this station represented a new philosophy, modular design. The core module launched first, and over the following decade, additional modules were added, a new laboratory here, a docking port there. each piece expanding capability, extending mission duration, creating a structure that could grow and adapt to changing needs. Mir became a home in space. Cosmonauts lived aboard for months at a stretch. Valery Polyakov set a record, 437 days in a single mission, more than 14 months floating in the same confined space, eating the same recycled air, watching the same planet turn below, and through such extended missions. Scientists learned crucial lessons about human physiology, about bone density loss and muscle atrophy, about psychological resilience and the importance of routine, about the small comforts that make isolation bearable, photographs of loved ones, the ability to call Earth, the precious moments when fresh supplies arrived with new crew members. America watched these achievements with a mixture of admiration and frustration. The Space Shuttle program had promised routine access to orbit, a reusable vehicle that would make spaceflight economical. But the Challenger disaster in 1986, when 7 astronauts perished just 73 seconds after launch, reminded everyone that space remained dangerous, that the price of exploration could be measured in lives, and that perhaps no single nation should bear the burden of maintaining a permanent presence beyond Earth. The geopolitical landscape was shifting too. The Soviet Union, burdened by economic stagnation and political upheaval, began to open its space program to collaboration, and NASA, recognizing both the technical expertise and the political opportunity, started to explore partnerships that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. In 1993, something remarkable happened. The United States and Russia formally agreed to merge their separate space station plans. America had been designing Freedom, an ambitious station concept that had grown increasingly expensive and complex. Russia was operating Mir, but struggling with funding, and the merger created a new vision, the International Space Station, a project that would eventually involve 15 nations, combining American shuttle capabilities with Russian experience in long-duration space flight, along with contributions from Europe, Japan, and Canada. This was not merely a technical decision. It was a profound statement about the future of space exploration, that the greatest achievements require cooperation, that national boundaries mean little when viewed from orbit, that former adversaries could become partners in pursuit of knowledge. The design phase consumed years. Engineers from different countries, working in different languages, using different measurement systems, had to align their visions. Every interface between modules had to be standardized. Every life support system had to be compatible. Every safety protocol had to be agreed upon. And underlying all the technical challenges was the delicate work of building trust, of learning to rely on systems built by former rivals, of accepting that success or failure would be shared equally. The station would be enormous, larger than any structure ever assembled in space, with a mass of nearly 1 million pounds when complete, stretching the length of a football field, including the solar arrays, containing as much livable space as a 6-bedroom house, and it would be built incrementally, launched piece by piece over more than a decade, each module carried to orbit and carefully attached to the growing structure, like constructing a ship while it sails, in an environment where the smallest mistake could cascade into catastrophe. In 1998, the construction began. Russia launched Zarya, the first module, a squat cylindrical component whose name means sunrise. It provided propulsion and power during the early assembly phase, and just weeks later, the Space Shuttle Endeavour carried Unity, the American-built node that would serve as a connecting hub. Astronauts performed the first assembly spacewalk, joining these two pieces with careful precision, bolting them together while traveling at 5 miles per second, 250 miles above the planet. And with that connection, made in the silence of space, witnessed by no one except those involved and the cameras that transmitted images back to Earth, the International Space Station was born, incomplete, barely functional, but real, a foundation upon which everything else would build. The years that followed were a ballet of precision and patience, module after module ascending from Earth, each launch a carefully choreographed event, months in the planning. The Space Shuttle became the primary delivery vehicle for American and international components, its cargo bay large enough to carry pressurized modules, its robotic arm capable of the delicate positioning required to mate one piece to another, while Russian Proton rockets carried their own contributions, heavy modules that added capability and volume to the growing station. Zvezda arrived in 2000, the Russian service module, Star in their language, and it brought something essential that had been missing: living quarters, a proper place for crew to sleep and eat and maintain hygiene. It contained a toilet, a luxury that transformed daily life, along with an oxygen generation system and water recycling equipment, because nothing can be wasted in space. Every drop of moisture, every breath must be captured and reprocessed, the station becoming a closed ecosystem where waste from one system feeds another in an endless cycle. Watching the construction unfold, even from the distance of Earth, required a recalibration of what seems possible, because the assembly happened in an environment utterly hostile to human life, where temperatures swing from 250 degrees Fahrenheit in sunlight to minus 250 in shadow, where micrometeoroids travel at thousands of miles per hour, where a tear in a spacesuit or a failed seal means death in less than a minute, and yet astronauts and cosmonauts suited up again and again, ventured outside the protective hull, worked for hours in their bulky white suits, manipulating tools with thick gloves, installing equipment, connecting power cables, torquing bolts to exact specifications while floating against the black. The first permanent crew arrived in November of 2000, Expedition 1, 3 men, American commander Bill Shepard and Russian cosmonauts Yuri Gitsenko and Sergei Krikalev, launched from Kazakhstan in a Soyuz capsule, docking with a station that was still incomplete, still rough around the edges, but habitable. And when they floated through the hatch, when they turned on the lights and began unpacking supplies, the International Space Station transitioned from construction project to inhabited outpost, a place where people would live continuously from that day forward, an unbroken human presence in space that continues even now, more than 2 decades later. Those early days were austere. The station had only 3 pressurized modules, limited power from solar arrays that had not yet reached their full configuration. The crew spent their time installing equipment, troubleshooting systems, learning the quirks and rhythms of their new home. They slept in sleeping bags attached to walls, ate rehydrated food that had improved somewhat since the early days, but still bore little resemblance to fresh meals. They exercised on a treadmill to combat the muscle loss that comes from living without gravity's resistance, and they looked out the windows at Earth turning below, at the thin blue line of atmosphere, at weather systems that could span entire continents, and they sent back photographs that reminded everyone why this effort mattered. More modules arrived. Destiny, the American laboratory. In 2001, a place for research in materials science and biology and fluid physics, experiments that could only be conducted in microgravity, where flames burn in perfect spheres, where crystals grow with flawless symmetry, where proteins fold into structures too delicate to form under the stress of gravity. And scientists on the ground began to use the station as it was intended, as a platform for discovery, sending up samples and instructions, receiving data that flowed down through communication satellites, a laboratory unlike any other, circling the planet every 90 minutes. The Canadian robotic arm arrived too, Canadarm2, 58 feet of articulated mechanical precision, capable of moving modules weighing tons, of serving as a mobile work platform for spacewalking astronauts, of catching visiting cargo vehicles and guiding them to docking ports. It became the station's essential tool, controlled from inside by operators who guided its movements with joysticks, watching through cameras mounted on the arm itself, developing an almost intuitive sense of its reach and capabilities. Japan contributed Kibo Hope, their laboratory module that arrived in sections between 2008 and 2009. The largest single module on the station, with its own airlock and external platform for experiments exposed to the vacuum of space. And Europe added Columbus, their research facility, and with each addition the station grew more capable, more complex, more of a true international endeavor, where equipment built in different countries had to work together seamlessly, where procedures written in different languages had to be translated and standardized, where crew members from different backgrounds had to live in close quarters and trust one another completely. Living aboard the station became a study in adaptation. Astronauts learned to move in 3 dimensions, pushing off walls with gentle precision, avoiding the instinct to reach out and catch yourself when you float too fast because there is no down to fall toward. They learned to sleep while floating, some preferring to be loosely strapped, others finding comfort in the confinement of a sleeping bag attached to a wall, and they learned the strange sensations of fluid shift, how blood and other fluids redistribute without gravity to pull them downward, creating puffy faces and bird-like legs, sinuses that feel perpetually congested, a sensation of fullness that suppresses appetite. Meals became social anchors, crew members gathering around the galley table in Zvezda, their food pouches attached with Velcro, drinks sipped through straws from sealed bags because liquids form floating blobs that could damage equipment if released. They shared the food sent from their respective space agencies, Russian cosmonauts offering caviar and jellied meat, Americans sharing barbecue and cobbler, Japanese astronauts contributing curry and ramen. These meals a reminder of home, of the diversity represented aboard the station, of the small pleasures that make isolation bearable. Exercise consumed hours each day, essential maintenance of muscle and bone that would otherwise deteriorate in the absence of gravitational loading. The treadmill required a harness to hold the runner down, creating artificial resistance The stationary bike had no seat because there was no need to support body weight, and the resistance machine allowed for weightlifting motions, crew members following prescribed routines, sweating in the recycled air, knowing that these sessions would determine how well they could walk when they finally returned to Earth. The view, though, remained endlessly compelling. The cupola arrived in 2010, a 7-window observation module, a dome of glass pointing toward Earth, and astronauts floated there during their precious free time, watching thunderstorms flicker over Africa, watching the Amazon snake through green jungle, watching city lights trace the coastlines at night, the Nile glowing like a thread of gold against the darkness of North Africa, the snow-covered Himalayas stark and jagged, the delicate whirl of hurricanes. And they described these sights in messages sent home, trying to capture in words what no words could adequately express. The fragility of the atmosphere, the absence of borders visible from space, the sense of Earth as a single entity, beautiful and isolated in the cosmic darkness. Spacewalks, extravehicular activities in the formal terminology, became routine yet never casual, each one requiring days of preparation, checking suit systems, reviewing procedures, pre-breathing pure oxygen to purge nitrogen from the bloodstream and prevent decompression sickness, and then the airlock depressurization, the opening of the hatch, the first view of Earth with nothing between you and the planet but the visor of your helmet. Astronauts described it as both terrifying and transcendent. The station, a small island of structure in an infinite ocean, their tether the only thing preventing an eternal fall into the void. They worked outside for hours, installing new equipment, replacing failed components, running cables. Their movements slow and deliberate because the suits were stiff and bulky, pressure ballooning the gloves until fingers ached from gripping tools. And through it all, the station continued its orbit, passing from day to night every 45 minutes, the sun appearing suddenly around Earth's curve, brilliant and harsh without atmosphere to soften it, then darkness again, stars appearing in numbers that defied description, the Milky Way, a river of light, and the work continued, guided by checklists and communication with mission control, each task checked off, each bolt verified, until finally, exhausted, they returned inside, their suits dotted with scorch marks from micrometeorite, impacts too small to penetrate but evidence of the environment's hostility. The station evolved constantly. New solar arrays unfurled like golden wings. Radiators extended to dissipate heat generated by equipment and crew. Cargo vehicles arrived regularly, Russian progress ships, European ATVs, Japanese HTVs, and eventually commercial vehicles from American companies, SpaceX's Dragon and Northrop Grumman's Cygnus, each bringing supplies, spare parts, fresh food, letters from home, and taking away trash and failed equipment, because nothing extra could accumulate. Every kilogram had to be accounted for. Science became the station's primary purpose. Thousands of experiments conducted over the years, growing plants in microgravity to understand how crops might sustain future missions to Mars, studying protein crystallization to develop new medicines, observing how flames behave without convection, testing materials for spacecraft construction, monitoring Earth's climate and weather patterns, analyzing samples of the astronauts themselves, their blood and bones and cardiovascular systems, because they were the experiment too, test subjects for understanding how humans adapt to space, what changes are reversible, and what might be permanent. And through all of this, the station-age systems that were cutting edge in 2000 became dated, requiring constant maintenance, troubleshooting, improvisation when parts failed, and replacements were months away. Astronauts became plumbers and electricians, diagnosing problems, repairing equipment, sometimes bypassing failed components with creative workarounds. The station less like a pristine laboratory and more like a beloved old house that requires constant attention but provides irreplaceable shelter. Crews came and went. 6 months became the standard duration, though some stayed longer, others shorter, depending on mission needs. They arrived via Soyuz capsules, 3 at a time. The Russian spacecraft that had been ferrying cosmonauts to orbit since the 1960s. Continuously refined but fundamentally unchanged, a reliable workhorse that could launch in almost any weather, that could return crew to Earth even if all other systems failed. A lifeboat always docked to the station, ready for emergency evacuation. The space shuttle continued its visits until 2011. Each mission a massive undertaking, the orbiter docking with the station for days or weeks, delivering modules and equipment too large for any other vehicle, and then, after the final shuttle mission, after Atlantis undocked for the last time and glided back to Earth, the station entered a new era, entirely dependent on Russian Soyuz for crew transport, on cargo vehicles from multiple nations for supplies, the capability to deliver large modules gone, the station's configuration essentially complete. This transition marked a shift in thinking. The focus moved from construction to utilization, to maximizing the science return from this expensive orbital laboratory. Researchers on the ground competed for experiment space, for crew time, for the precious resource of microgravity, and the astronauts became expert technicians, conducting experiments designed by others, following protocols, maintaining equipment, documenting results, their days scheduled in 5-minute increments. Every moment accounted for, a mixture of science and maintenance and exercise, and the occasional quiet hour to simply exist in this extraordinary place. The station's orbit carried it over 90% of Earth's populated areas, passing over cities and villages, forests and deserts, oceans and ice caps, and cameras pointed downward captured images that revealed changes happening across the planet. Deforestation in the Amazon, glaciers retreating in the Himalayas, urban sprawl consuming farmland, algae blooms in warming seas, the station becoming an observation platform for understanding Earth's changing climate, a perspective available nowhere else, continuous, comprehensive, undistorted by atmosphere. Partnerships deepened over the years. What began as a practical merger of American and Russian programs evolved into genuine collaboration. Crew members trained together for years before their missions, learning each other's languages, studying in Houston and Moscow and Cologne and Tsukuba, forming bonds that transcended national identity. And aboard the station they worked as a unified team. Titles like commander and flight engineer, less important than the shared understanding that survival depended on cooperation, that in space there are no borders, no flag important enough to override the necessity of working together. New capabilities arrived. BEAM, the Bigelow Expandable Activity Module, launched in 2016, a test of inflatable habitat technology, packed small for launch and then expanded in orbit like a balloon. Its walls, made of layers of fabric and protective materials, softer than metal but surprisingly durable, and it worked, providing additional storage space, demonstrating that future habitats might be built lighter and launched more efficiently than traditional rigid modules. Commercial crew programs matured. SpaceX developed the Dragon capsule capable of carrying astronauts. Boeing worked on Starliner, American companies taking over crew transport, ending sole reliance on Russian vehicles. The first commercial crew mission launched in 2020, a return of American launch capability after 9 years, and it proved that private enterprise could meet the exacting standards of human space flight, could provide reliable access to orbit, could innovate in ways that traditional aerospace had not. The station's population fluctuated, sometimes 3 crew members, sometimes 6 or 7 when vehicles overlapped. And the difference was noticeable. More people meant more science, but also more noise, more competition for the bathroom, more carefully managed resources. Fewer people meant quieter periods, more space to move, but also more workload distributed among fewer hands, each dynamic bringing its own challenges and rewards. Long-duration records fell. 1 year, missions tested the limits of human endurance. Scott Kelly and Mikhail Kornienko spending 340 days aboard in 2015 and 16, and the data collected from them, compared with Scott's twin brother Mark on Earth, provided insights into genetic changes, vision problems, immune system function, all crucial for planning eventual missions to Mars, where crew would spend years in space with no possibility of quick return. Equipment aged and was replaced. The carbon dioxide scrubbers that cleaned the air, the water recovery systems that purified urine and condensation back into drinking water, achieving 90% efficiency, an engineering marvel that astronauts joked about while sipping yesterday's coffee, the oxygen generators that split water molecules into breathable air and hydrogen vented overboard, all of these systems requiring constant monitoring, occasional repair, and the knowledge that failure could mean evacuation, that the margin between comfort and crisis remained perpetually thin. The toilet, a subject of endless fascination to those on Earth and crucial concern to those aboard, evolved through several iterations, Russian and American systems with different approaches, but both facing the same challenge: how to manage human waste in an environment where nothing falls, where suction must replace gravity, where solid waste is dried and stored, liquid waste processed for water recovery, the indignity of it offset by the absolute necessity. And the humor crew members maintained about biological functions in space became part of the culture, a way to normalize what was fundamentally strange. Resupply missions became routine, arriving every few months, the docking of cargo vehicles sometimes watched live by people on Earth through cameras streaming from the station, the robotic arm reaching out to capture the approaching spacecraft, the careful ballet of bringing it to the docking port, and then the hatch opening, the smell of fresh supplies, apples and oranges, clothing and equipment, letters and care packages, small luxuries that reminded the crew they were not forgotten, that thousands of people on the ground worked to support their mission, that the station existed as part of a vast infrastructure spanning the globe. Scientific discoveries accumulated quietly, Protein crystals grown in microgravity led to new drug formulations. Observations of how flames spread in the absence of convection informed fire safety. Studies of bone loss pointed toward treatments for osteoporosis on Earth. Experiments with fluid dynamics revealed behaviors impossible to predict from theory alone. The station became what it was meant to be, a laboratory where the absence of gravity revealed fundamental truths about physics and chemistry and biology, where the peculiar conditions enabled research that justified the enormous cost and risk. Earth observation evolved into a systematic program. Astronauts trained to photograph specific locations at precise times, capturing glaciers and coral reefs and urban development, volcanoes and wildfires and seasonal changes, building a database of images spanning decades, a visual record of a planet in transformation. And sometimes crew members simply photographed what caught their eye, a perfect storm formation, the aurora dancing green and purple along magnetic field lines, the lights of their hometown passing below. These images shared with the world, making space feel closer, more accessible, less abstract. Medical monitoring grew more sophisticated. Ultrasounds performed in orbit, blood samples analyzed, cardiovascular function tracked. Because every crew member was a research subject, their bodies adapting to space in ways both expected and surprising. Vision changes from fluid shift and pressure on the optic nerve. Muscle atrophy despite hours of daily exercise. Bone density loss concentrated in weight-bearing areas, the immune system shifting in response to the closed environment. And all of this data fed into understanding, into preparing for missions beyond low Earth orbit, for journeys where medical evacuation would not be possible. The station survived close calls. Debris from satellite collisions forcing crew into Soyuz capsules, ready to undock and flee if impact seemed imminent. Ammonia leaks from cooling systems requiring emergency repairs. Computer failures that switched the station to backup modes, and each incident reinforced the fragility of life in space, the thin margin between success and catastrophe, the importance of training and redundancy and crew capable of responding calmly to crisis. When partnerships expanded beyond the original 15 nations, experiments flew from universities and research institutions worldwide. International cooperation extending to countries without their own space programs. The station becoming a shared resource, a place where humanity pooled its knowledge and capabilities. And in quiet moments, crew members reflected on this, on how borders that seemed so important on the surface meant nothing from orbit, how the station demonstrated what becomes possible when competition yields to collaboration. The years accumulated into decades. Systems designed for 15-year lifespans stretched beyond 20, with regular maintenance and careful management. New modules proposed but never launched as budgets tightened. The station aging but enduring, crew members coming and going, nearly 250 people from 19 countries having lived aboard by the early 2020s, each bringing their own perspective, each returning changed by the experience, trying to describe what it meant to float weightless, to see Earth whole, to live for months in an environment utterly dependent on human-made systems, to trust your life to colleagues from nations that were once adversaries, and gradually the conversation began to shift toward what comes after, because the station could not orbit forever. Systems would eventually fail beyond repair, structural fatigue would accumulate, and decisions would need to be made about whether to extend the mission, to build a replacement, to shift human presence to lunar orbit or the moon's surface, to perhaps recognize that this chapter, remarkable as it had been, would eventually close, making way for whatever future generations would build next. But even as the future beckons, there remains something worth considering about what already exists, about the quiet miracle of this place that circles overhead, unnoticed by most, a constant presence in the sky. And to truly appreciate it, one must dwell on the details, on the texture of life lived in such extraordinary circumstances, on the small moments that reveal larger truths. Consider the water, every drop precious, condensation collected from the air, perspiration absorbed from exercise, even urine processed through filters and purification systems, transformed back into drinking water so pure it exceeds what most people consume on Earth, and crew members overcome their initial hesitation, recognizing that in space, waste is simply matter waiting to be reclaimed, that survival depends on closing every loop, on treating nothing as disposable, a lesson perhaps worth remembering on the planet below. Consider the plants, grown in controlled chambers under LED lights, lettuce and radishes and zinnia flowers, their roots growing in substrate rather than soil. Water delivered directly to avoid the chaos of irrigation in weightlessness. Astronauts tending these small gardens with care that seems disproportionate until you understand what they represent. The possibility of self-sufficiency, of fresh food grown far from Earth, of green living things in a metal habitat, and the psychological comfort they provide, color and growth and the smell of vegetation, connections to the natural world. Consider the silence, because space makes no sound. The vacuum carries no pressure waves, no medium for noise to travel, and yet inside the station, the air circulation fans create a constant white noise, equipment hums and clicks, pumps whir, ventilation systems whoosh, a mechanical symphony that crew members eventually stop hearing consciously until something fails and sudden silence alerts them to trouble. And they realize they have learned to sleep despite the noise, have adapted as humans always do, making any environment feel normal through sheer familiarity. Consider the isolation, not the romantic solitude of wilderness, but the absolute certainty that no one can reach you quickly if something goes wrong. That rescue would take hours at minimum, that you and your crewmates must solve every problem with only what exists aboard, and this creates a particular kind of bond, a trust that goes beyond friendship, knowing that your life depends on the competence and care of others, and theirs on yours, that there is no room for ego or carelessness, that everyone must perform flawlessly because the consequences of failure are absolute. Consider the perspective shift. Astronauts describe it, the overview effect, seeing Earth without borders, the atmosphere so thin it looks fragile, the realization that every human who has ever lived, every conflict and creation, every love and loss occurred on that small blue sphere, and from orbit it appears both beautiful and vulnerable, a closed system like the station itself, with finite resources, recycling air and water through natural processes, and the insight becomes visceral that we are all crew members on a planetary spacecraft, sharing the same life support system, dependent on its continued function. Consider the adaptation, how quickly the body learns to move in 3 dimensions, to sleep without the pressure of gravity, to eat floating food, to work upside down because those orientations cease to have meaning, and how difficult the return becomes, landing after months in space, feeling crushing weight, dropping objects instinctively released, struggling to walk in a straight line, the body having to relearn what gravity means, and astronauts speak of missing weightlessness, the freedom of movement, the ease of floating, even as they relish showers and wind and the smell of grass. Consider the time, measured not in sunrises and sunsets, but in orbit numbers, in mission-elapsed days, in scheduled activities and rest periods, the station operating on Greenwich Mean Time as a compromise among time zones, but the rhythm of work and rest, maintaining structure, because humans need routine, need the delineation between labor and leisure, even when day and night lose their terrestrial meaning, and crew members create rituals, movie nights, shared meals, quiet time by the cupola, small anchors of normalcy in an utterly abnormal existence. Consider the communication to emails sent to family, video calls scheduled when satellites align, voice loops connecting crew to mission control, and the strange delay as signals bounce around the globe, conversations with people who understand your experience and those who never truly can, trying to explain what it feels like to float, to see 16 sunrises, to live in a place where up and down are arbitrary, and sensing the inadequacy of words, the gap between experience and description. Consider the dreams, because astronauts dream, floating in their sleeping bags, tethered loosely to walls, and their dreams retain gravity. They walk and fall and feel weight, their unconscious minds clinging to Earth even as their bodies adapt to space, and they wake floating, remember where they are, orient themselves in the darkness, and perhaps drift back to sleep, or perhaps float to a window, watching the planet turn below in the permanent night. Consider the legacy, not just scientific discoveries or technological advances, but the proof of concept that humans can work together across languages and cultures, that former enemies can become partners, that nations can pool resources toward shared goals, that cooperation yields results impossible for any single country. And while this lesson has not transformed Earth politics, while conflict and division persist, the station remains evidence that another way is possible, that when facing challenges large enough, humanity can transcend its smaller differences, and perhaps, in the end, this is the station's deepest purpose, not the experiments or observations, valuable as they are, but the demonstration that we can build something together, maintain it together, live in it together, that the boundaries we draw are less fundamental than the commonalities we share, and that the future of human presence beyond Earth, if it comes, will require exactly this kind of collaboration, because no single nation possesses the resources or knowledge to settle other worlds alone. The station continues its orbit, night after night, visible to those who know when and where to look, a moving star brighter than most, carrying its small crew through the darkness. And aboard, the routines persist, experiments running, equipment maintained, meals shared, exercise completed, windows gazed through, and the work continues, quiet, persistent, away from headlines and public attention. the slow accumulation of knowledge, the daily proof that humans can survive and even thrive beyond Earth's surface. There is comfort in this constancy, in knowing that while the world below churns with change and uncertainty, the station follows its predictable path, crossing the same ground every 90 minutes, the physics of orbital mechanics indifferent to human drama. And perhaps this too offers insight that some things transcend politics and crisis, that the pursuit of knowledge continues, that the human impulse to explore persists, that we build and maintain and discover even in the most challenging environments. The station will not last forever. Already discussions proceed about its eventual decommissioning, about controlled re-entry that will see most of it burn up in the atmosphere, fragments falling into remote ocean, and something will surely follow, whether another station or lunar outpost or missions to Mars. The specific form uncertain, but the trajectory clear. Humanity will continue reaching beyond its home world, continue testing the limits of what is possible. But for now, tonight, the station glides through the darkness, its lights visible from the ground on clear evenings, a testament to what has been achieved, to the engineers and astronauts and cosmonauts, to the politicians who funded it, and the public who supported it, to the idea that some endeavors justify their cost, not in immediate returns, but in expanded possibility, in the knowledge gained and the capabilities developed, in the inspiration provided to those who look up and wonder. And maybe that is enough, to know it is there, circling, watching over the planet, a human-made moon carrying its cargo of dreamers and scientists, floating in the silence, doing their work, living their extraordinary, ordinary lives, while below the world turns, and some look up, and some dream, and the future unfolds, slowly, inevitably, one orbit at a time. The station floats on, through day and night that blend and separate, through the thin line between Earth and everything beyond, and in its passage, in its endurance, it whispers something about human nature, about our need to explore, to understand, to reach beyond what seems possible, to build homes in impossible places, and perhaps to recognize finally that we are all already living on a spacecraft, fragile and beautiful, traveling through the cosmos with only each other and the systems we maintain between us and the infinite cold. And so the lights continue their arc across the sky, steady, patient, waiting for those who choose to notice, to pause, to consider what they represent. And maybe in that moment of looking up, something shifts, some small recognition that we are capable of remarkable things when we work together, when we commit to something larger than ourselves, when we recognize that the barriers between us are less significant than the common journey we share. The station orbits, and the world turns below, and the story continues, written in the trails of light across the darkness, in the quiet work of those who float among the stars, in the steady proof that humans can survive and thrive beyond the world that made them, and in that survival, in that thriving, perhaps we see a glimpse of what we might become if we choose, if we dare, if we remember that the sky is not a limit, but an invitation, always there, always waiting for those who look up and wonder and dream.